Assalamu alaikum and good morning. On behalf of the Institute of Regional Studies, I would like to welcome you all to our one-day conference called Future Prospects for Afghanistan and the Region. We would like to start with recitation from the Holy Quran.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم قل هو الله أحد الله الصمد لم يلد ولم يولد ولم يكن له كفوا أحد.
Today, we have a very esteemed panel that is going to talk to you about the future prospects for Afghanistan. Post-US withdrawal, Afghanistan, after the takeover by the Taliban on August 15, 2021, has been faced with many challenges, which are internal, regional, and global. Despite being at the helm of affairs for a year, the Taliban face insurmountable difficulties in maintaining peace, dealing with governance issues, human rights, and a crippled economy. In addition, they have not been successful in getting their government recognized. The Taliban have been hampered by ethnic, religious, and political diversity within Afghanistan and have to deal with divisions within their own factions and winning the support of the Afghan people. The exodus of skilled workers drained the country's frozen assets, international sanctions, deficient domestic resources, dysfunctional institutions have contributed to making the situation very difficult. Inadequate governance, ungoverned spaces has provided a fertile ground for terrorist groups operating in the country with transnational agenda. The presence of cross-border terrorism is a cause of concern for Afghanistan as well as its neighbors and the global community. Escalation of cross-border violence could affect regional security, posing problems for regional connectivity and trade among regional states. It may be in the interest of Afghanistan's neighbors through regional alignment to assist the Taliban in peace building, trade promotion, and governance. Furthermore, a more inclusive approach on Afghanistan by the international community could be an answer to the woes of the Afghan. During the last 4 decades, Afghanistan's potential role as a contributor to development and prosperity in Asia has largely remained unrealized. Were it to become a stable neighbor, it could be the heart of Asia and serve to connect South and Central Asia. Today, we have the first panel with us, which is going to be on Afghanistan's internal political dynamics. Our session chair is Ambassador Syed Abrar Hussain, who is the Vice Chairman of IPS. And we have Ambassador Azaz Chaudhry, who is Director General in ISSI, Mr. Salman Javed, who is Director General PAYF, Pak Afghan Youth Forum. We have Mr. Hassan Khan, who is a senior journalist who will be joining us in a bit, and Ms. Heather Barr, who is the Associate Director of Women's Rights Division, Human Rights Watch. She will be joining us online. Sir, I would like to hand you the floor now.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, and thank you very much. Welcome to this first working session of today's conference. As you know, the topic for the first working session is internal political dynamics of Afghanistan. And there are two sub-themes: issues of inclusivity, governance, and legitimacy. And then another sub-theme is Afghanistan's humanitarian and economic challenges. Well, the topic can cover vast areas. For example, when we talk of political dynamics, we can discuss the internal rift among Taliban, their softened rhetoric, the hardliners' approach, the difference of approaches among Taliban factions, then the political challenges faced by them from within and from without. No one is recognizing them right now. The human rights and women rights issues, the trust deficit between the Taliban government and international community, then economic challenges faced by them, the humanitarian issues, and so many other things. all can be covered under this topic. And for the convenience of speakers, as I said, we have divided into two sub-themes. The first sub-theme will be covered by a panel of learned speakers. We are lucky to have Ambassador Azaz Ahmad Chaudhary Saab with us today. He is former Foreign Secretary and currently he is Director General of Institute of Strategic Studies. I welcome him to this conference and request him to speak on the first sub-theme. Thank you, sir.
Thank you. And thank you to IRS for organizing yet another useful event. And thank you, Chair Abrar Saab. We, in fact, all three of us have been in the Foreign Service and spent considerable time together. Yesterday, when I was watching the Pakistan-Afghanistan match, I don't get too excited. Sometimes people get too excited, so I generally don't. I try to go away a little bit. It was very, but when it happened, I knew one team would win. And I thought, you know, I felt happy in a way about Afghanistan that it has matured as a country and has produced such a good team because they were about to win, honestly. And so in a way, the trappings of sovereignty are falling in place one by one. But this morning, when I got up and I saw the scenes of chairs being unplugged and thrown away in frustration by the Afghan spectators, I felt that this is a accumulated frustration and perhaps an attitude towards Pakistan because they have lost to other teams too. So we in Pakistan have always been under the conviction that these are two neighbors which have lived ever since together and will continue to live in future too. And therefore, some kind of peaceful coexistence. In fact, we call it brotherly ties. We don't even say peaceful coexistence. We don't even say friendship, but we go a step further. And to that extent, a lot has been done by Pakistan. There's no doubt about it. But why is it and how is it that the frustration in Afghanistan about Pakistan is so intense? Is it sponsored frustration by Ashraf Ghani regime and before him Karzai regime? You were there, or is it a genuine frustration with Pakistan under the illusion that Pakistan interfered in their country so much and is responsible for the trouble that? So that's just a side remark I thought I should make because I'm still struggling to understand why such an intense feeling of dislike for Pakistan that was displayed in the stadium. Topic that you have given is the internal situation in Afghanistan. My own reading, and we also do a lot of events on Afghanistan, my cumulative reading tells me that situation remains very grim. I would even call it precarious. Prima facie, security has improved a little, barring some terrorist incidents perpetrated by ISKP and perhaps some other terrorist forces also gaining roots. But the situation on the economic side and on the administrative governance side is worrisome, actually. So three particular areas that I was asked to talk about. One is inclusivity. Now, there's no doubt that while the Americans were negotiating with the Taliban did agree through the Doha Agreement of February 2020 that they would support an interim setup which will be inclusive. Interim setup they did, but inclusive, I think they did not. They have about 4 Uzbek and 2 Tajik and I have their names somewhere. But they are not the most prominent figures of these 2 communities, and they don't really represent those big. Nor has Taliban learned the lesson from Afghan history that whenever that it is a multi-ethnic society, multicultural society, multi-faith society even. And unless they carry everybody along, there will never be stability. I remember, Professor Rabbani established his government, and you saw the aftermath, and which created the Taliban. But then the Taliban were not included in the bond process, despite suggestions from Pakistan. And the result is before us. Now, the same thing will happen to Taliban if they don't include. And we hear every once in a while formation of national movement for resistance. We have heard such news from Istanbul. We have heard some news from Panjshir Valley. So we can see very clearly that some ethnic factions will ultimately take up arms against them. So, and then they might have foreign supporters. The names are quite well known. So if that be the case, then we are looking at a scenario in a medium to long term of the country descending once again into a civil war. Now, that should be a point of high concern, not only for Afghan society, it should be, but also for us, because we will also suffer as much as the Afghans would from any chaos in Afghanistan, because that chaos ultimately spills over the borders towards Pakistan, and then also provides a space for detractors of Pakistan to create difficulties for Pakistan. So therefore, we have every reason to be concerned that the Taliban government is not inclusive. And I think we have voiced it formally and informally several times that it would be in the larger interest of a peaceful Afghanistan that the Taliban should form an inclusive government. The interim government, the interim part they have kept. It's been more than a year, but it's still interim. But they have not really gone ahead and broadened it. Then there is also, so there are 3 kinds of inclusivity. One is the ethnic inclusivity. Then there is also a sectarian or religious faith-based inclusivity, which basically means that there are Sunnis and there are Shias and there are some others, but very tiny minority, in even Sikhs. But essentially, Hazaras have faced the wrath of ethnic animosity in Afghanistan a lot. And some of it happens also in Pakistan's Balochistan. And I think, but there is a consciousness here. In Afghanistan, this is quite systemic. Master Brar would probably bear me out. So I think that's another aspect that they need to work on, to include some Hazara elements to bolster their confidence in that their rights will also be protected. The third element of inclusivity in my mind is the gender inclusivity. It is very sensitive because 50% of population for any country is women folk, plus minus 1 or 2%. So the Taliban's attitude towards the women is highly undesirable, and I would say even abhorrent. I've heard their interviews in which they claim to the American journalists and others that every country has its own cultural norms, and Afghanistan is also following its own norms, which are cultural and Islamic. But I've also done the readings where many Islamic jurists have said that locking up women in their homes and not providing them opportunities for education or work or free movement is not Islamic. So therefore, I don't think they can use the injunctions of Islam to strangulate 50% of the population. So the world is very sensitive about it. And I think Pakistan too is sensitive about it, that they got to. Now, recently, I think only a few days ago, in Paktika province, they allowed girls to go to 6th grade, not beyond yet. Primary they allow, but secondary they just made a beginning, but it's only in Paktika, so we don't know. So it's not a favor that they render to the international community. It's their obligation, their faith-based obligation, and their national obligation to also have inclusivity of women folk in workspaces and in education. Now, the second aspect on which I was asked to talk about was governance. Again, as I indicated in my earlier remarks, my characterization of the situation is grim. The donors have by and large left. So donations and aid and assistance has by and large dried up. The Taliban have been able to raise some revenues from customs duties and other taxes. I'm told it is to the tune of $400 million, but that's not certainly sufficient for them to run the economy. And then we have, they have also controlled narcotics drugs, which is something good. But I remember there were people who were suspecting that if the crunch comes, they might actually start doing it because, but so far, I think they have honored that, that aspect. Apart from economy, the other area of governance is the public administration, on which they have, they are running short of experts and even expertise to manage the government departments, ministries, and civil services. Many of the people have left. Those who are still there are trying to leave, despite the assurances given by the Taliban that they will not take any revengeful action against them. Some of them have stayed back. They are still working there, but I think it hasn't reached a level of confidence where they have enough manpower, trained manpower to run the government machinery. So most of the administration is still through ad hoc measures, and that's another issue. The related aspect of that administration or governance is security. True that they have brought in some security, but we can all see signs of terrorist entities coming back. ISKP is very, very active, but others are also, I think, gearing up, including two entities which are of great concern to Pakistan. One is TTP and the other is BLA. And I think the Taliban haven't really, stepped up their actions to the satisfaction of Pakistan. And instead, they have suggested to us to negotiate with them. And now that is something, in principle, negotiations should always be welcomed. But to negotiate with people who have murdered our children so mercilessly, I, as a citizen of Pakistan, not as a speaker here, find it very difficult. I think the only way to negotiate is if they give up their arms against Pakistan and they also submit to the sovereignty of Pakistan. If they have this pipe dream that they can create a state in ex-FATA region, I think that won't happen. They are underestimating the resolve of Pakistan. But anyway, the Taliban need to understand how strongly we feel about this particular issue. And I'm sure others are equally concerned, although some of them are very forthcoming. China, Uzbekistan but they are also very, very concerned about the possibility of their terrorist groups coming back. And Tajikistan, is very upset. So Turkmenistan professes neutrality. Iran too is also concerned. The Taliban need to realize that they are surrounded by countries which have serious, deep concerns about terrorism resurfacing in Afghanistan. So we can see that on the whole, the governance remains a major issue for them. How long will they be able to hold on to it? Just mere by coercion is anybody's guess. Now, third element is legitimacy, and there also no country in the world, including Pakistan, has so far extended de jure formal recognition to the Taliban government. Everyone recognizes them as a de facto government. In Pakistan, some people don't like to call them even government, and they call them as the group. But I am one of those. I am one of those who believe that they need to they are a de facto government, and everyone is already engaging with them, including the United States. Although United States has closed its missions, hasn't opened it, but many countries have started opening their missions, and to the best of my information, now there are 17 missions operating in Kabul at this moment, the latest being that of India. So we have a situation where none of the countries, neighboring countries or the broader international community is willing to extend formal recognition to them until they fulfill the expectations of the international community and their own commitments to the international community in respect of the three assurances. One was that it will be an inclusive government. The second was that they'll respect women's rights. And the third was that they will not allow terrorist entities to use Afghan soil against neighbors and beyond. So therefore, my sense is that even the voices within Pakistan, and I've shared podium on TV talk shows with those who would plead that we must incentivize them in order for them to fulfill those, because, and they have an argument. I'm not saying it's pointless. The argument is that if you don't bolster their capacity to deliver on these commitments, then how can you expect them to deliver? So that's the argument. So it's a catch-22 for them, whether they should first deliver on these commitments or whether the international community. So one major chunk of finances withheld by the US, as you know, is Afghan own money. There was a ray of hope that half of it might get delivered to the Taliban, but even that was dashed after the leader of Al Qaeda was assassinated or killed in Kabul. So let me quickly sum up. Hassan साहब अभी आए हैं तो इनके लिए भी जरा आसानी हो जाएगी कि my views on inclusivity is that the Taliban have fallen well short on ethnic inclusivity, on sectarian inclusivity, on gender-based inclusivity. And I think they need to take steps, because you don't need Western countries' money to deliver on these. This is a policy that they can deliver on without getting any help from anywhere. And the second, on governance, on the economic side, yes, there is a serious situation, and they are finding it very hard to run the government. But and I think the countries are helping to the extent they can, mostly for humanitarian assistance. But that too, most of the humanitarian assistance is not going through the coffers of the Taliban government, but through other channels. On administrative structures, I have indicated that they are facing real shortage of trained manpower to run the government machinery. And on security, in prima facie, there is some security, better security, but ISKP attacks and others are continuing, and some of the other terrorist entities are resurfacing. So we should be really worried about it. And finally, on legitimacy, I think you heard me, Hassan Saab, so you can comment on that. But my sense is that there is a reluctance on the part of all neighbors, the broader international community, to extend legitimacy to them unless they change their policy and attitude and tell the world that they are a different bunch from the ones that ruled in Afghanistan in the 1990s. I think that then only countries will begin to move towards the formal recognition. Incidentally, we have an issue now because our ambassador has retired and our new ambassador is going, but we don't know where from to get the agrima and the and all that. So I think they'll find a solution. So with that, I return the floor to you, Chair. Thank you.
So thank you so much. You have covered all aspects of the sub-theme, and you have done it very comprehensively. Before inviting the next speaker, I'll just have brief comments on 2-3 issues. Like the first was why there's dislike for Pakistan in Afghanistan, why there's so much frustration. Well, I think there are 2 aspects of this. Number 1, historical legacy. And number 2, the propaganda launched against us by the Afghan TV channels for the last 20 years. And India had heavily invested for that purpose. In just 1 year, India spent, I'll say rather invested $40 million in Afghan media. And that was done not for pro-India propaganda, but for Pakistan bashing. And that was a successful case. And when I say historical legacy, well, it's a long history even before Pakistan came into being. If you recall the history, all those on this side of the border had been enemies of Afghanistan, whether it was British, whether it was Sikhs, or whether before Muslim government in India, it were Hindus. Jaipal was ruling till Kabul at one time and pushed back by Subukhtagin and then Mahmud of Ghazna and onwards. And then when Afghans talk about Punjabis, and even some of our Pashtuns talk about Punjabis and they hate them, it is because of the Sikhs. I mean, it was not Muslim Punjabis. It was because they were fighting the Sikh Punjabis. So there was a natural hatred because of that. And because of all this historical legacy, what Afghanistan did was, in fact, that when Pakistan came into being in 1947, they failed to realize that now it's a friendly Muslim government on their border. It's not British, it's not Sikhs, it's a newborn state. And they could have very friendly relations with Pakistan, but unfortunately, it all began on a negative note. Then about inclusive government in Afghanistan. Well, as Ambassador Azaz very rightly said, there are just a few Tajiks and Uzbeks in the government. Even if the Taliban don't accept that other groups should join the government, groups other than Taliban, as their argument is that nowhere the opposition is part of the government. But even then, the ethnic groups should have representation according to their population. If Tajiks are there 27%, if Hazaras and Uzbeks are 8 to 9% each, then that representation should be reflected in the cabinet, in the senior officials, and so on. But that's not done. So it's not a representative government from ethnic point of view. And similarly, as he rightly said, from sectarian point of view or even from a gender point of view. Well, from gender point of view, I think they have no right to put an Islamic tag on the ban for education for women or ban on women's rights, because Islam was the first religion perhaps which encourages education for women. And the Holy Prophet once said that talabul ilm farizatun ala kulli muslimin wa muslima. Although in Arabic, if he had said only Muslim, that also covered both genders. But in order to specify, perhaps he knew that there would be a time when people would say that education is only for men and not for women. So he specified it that it's obligatory for every Muslim man and every Muslim woman. And then Maulana Taqi Usmani wrote a letter to Taliban saying it, that education should be allowed for women as well. So no way that you can put an Islamic tag to it. About terrorism, yes, all the regional countries have fears, they have apprehensions. We, because of TTP, Uzbekistan and Central Asia, because of Uzbekistan Islamic movement, Tajikistan, because of Ansarullah, China, because of ETIM, and then the world at large and the region generally because of Al-Qaeda and Daesh, of course. Well, I'll stop here and request the next speaker. We have Mr. Salman Javed, who is Director General, Pakistan Afghan Youth Forum. I'll request all speakers to kindly limit their remarks to 10 minutes, so we can finish it in time. Thank you so much.
Thank you so
Mr.
much.
Salman Javed.
His Excellencies, thank you for having me over here. Much have been said by Honorable Ezaaz Saab. मैं बहुत quickly sum up करूँगा क्योंकि बहुत सारी बातें already Ezaaz साहब ने कह दी हुई हैं. But before jumping into whatever has been happening right now in Afghanistan, because I've been to Afghanistan in the past few months, और वहाँ पे बहुत सारे अफगान्स के साथ जो इंटरेक्शन हमारा होता है, उस हवाले से मैं चाहूँगा कि मैं यहाँ पे वो बयान करूँ rather than whatever has been said on media. So I will try to narrate those things that I have observed by myself on the ground. लेकिन उससे पहले एक preamble है, why Afghan Taliban or the Islamic Emirate, the interim government of Afghanistan, current interim government of Afghanistan is there where it is right now. That is at the throne of Kabul. अगर आप इसका एक थोड़ा सा preamble देखें तो 20 साल की जो जंग थी जब अमेरिका यहाँ पर आया और उसके बाद उसने एक claim किया था, and that claim was कि we are here to rebuild Afghanistan and to install the democratic norms over here in Afghanistan for the nation building. ये George W. Bush की statement थी. But over the period of past 20 years, हुआ ये कि दो जो गवर्नमेंट्स हैं, करज़ई साहब की और गनी साहब की, उनके अंदर सिर्फ 2001 से लेके 2019 तक वर्ल्ड बैंक का जो डाटा है उसके मुताबिक $77 बिलियन का डेवलपमेंट एड का जो पैसा है वो आया अफगानिस्तान के अंदर. कंपेयर करें इसको इस चीज़ से कि पाकिस्तान की टोटल जो पॉपुलेशन है वो इस वक्त 22 करोड़ के करीब है और अफगानिस्तान की टोटल पॉपुलेशन इस वक्त 4 करोड़ के करीब है, जो कि इस वक्त वहाँ पे मौजूद है. उसके अलावा जो डायस्पोरा है उसके अलावा इसको कंपेयर करें इस बात से कि पाकिस्तान का जो CPEC का प्रोजेक्ट है वो $44 बिलियन का है, जिसके ऊपर जो कि एड प्रोजेक्ट नहीं है बल्कि एक लोन और इन्वेस्टमेंट प्रोजेक्ट है, और उसके मुकाबले में एक एड अमाउंट जारी है $77 बिलियन की एक ऐसी मुल्क के अंदर जिसको मैनेज करना और जिसको रीबिल्ड करना शायद बहुत आसान होता अगर वो इसको प्रॉपरली इन्वेस्ट करते और इसको सही मायनों में इस्तेमाल करते. बट अनफॉर्चुनेटली व्हाट हैपेंड वाज कि आप जब जाते हैं अफगानिस्तान के अंदर, द फर्स्ट इंटरेक्शन दैट आई हैड विद अफगानिस्तान एज अ टेरिटरी, और मैं जब उधर गया और काबुल के अंदर जब मैंने लैंड किया तो आई हैड दिस इंप्रेशन इन माइंड कि मैं जब जाऊंगा वहाँ पे तो शायद वहाँ पे बहुत एक ज़बरदस्त किस्म का इंफ्रास्ट्रक्चर मुझे मिलेगा, कम अज़ कम इस्लामाबाद के मुकाबले का. बट अनफॉर्चुनेटली व्हेन यू लैंड इनटू अफगानिस्तान व्हाट यू सी इज़ के आप काबुल के अंदर यू डोंट फाइंड अ सिंगल signal, traffic signal been properly operated over there. آپ کو ایک بھی فلائی اوور اور انڈر پاس نہیں ملتا. پرابلی دیر ور پرابلی سم سیکورٹی ریزنس یا کچھ اور. لیکن جب میں وہاں پہ گیا تو پتہ چلا کہ بہت ساری جو ان کی روڈس تھیں وہ صرف بلاک رہتی تھی اس وجہ سے کیونکہ سیکورٹی کانوائز جو تھے انہوں نے مسلسل گزرنا ہوتا تھا اور ٹریفک جو تھی وہ مسلسل بلاک رہتی تھی. سو مچ سو کہ ابھی بھی جب آپ جاتے ہیں کابل کے اندر اور اب تمام روڈس کھل چکی ہیں, اس کے باوجود آپ جو اسلام آباد کی ٹریفک دیکھتے ہیں یہ اس کے مقابلے میں بہت کم ہے. آپ جو کراچی کا یا لاہور کا ٹریفک دیکھتے ہیں وہ بھی اس کے مقابلے میں بہت مینجڈ ہے. تو یو کین امیجن کہ اس وقت افغانستان کا جو انفراسٹرکچر تھا پچھلے 20 سالوں کے اندر یا جو ڈیولپمنٹ تھی, صرف جو سب سے بڑا سٹی تھا, جو سب سے مین سٹی تھا کابل, اس کا کیا حال تھا. اور پھر آپ جب سبربس میں جاتے ہیں ان سٹیز کے, چاہے وہ کندہار ہو, کابل ہو, جلال آباد ہو, یو کین گیٹ دا آئیڈیا کہ وہ تمام پیسہ جو کہ افغانستان کے اندر آ رہا تھا وہ کہاں جا رہا تھا. So this created a psyche and an opportunity for the Taliban to play around کہ اس وقت افغانستان میں جو گورنمنٹ بیٹھی ہوئی ہے وہ کسی بھی طریقے سے افغانستان کے حق میں کام نہیں کری, بلکہ وہ ایک ڈپلائڈ گورنمنٹ ہے. اور پھر ان کے پاس اور بھی نیریٹو تھے آکوپیشن کے اور باقی تمام چیزیں. اس کے علاوہ وہاں پہ کھلی چھوٹ تھی, جو فورن ٹروپس تھے وہ وہاں پر آتے تھے. نائٹ ریڈز کا ہمیں پتہ ہے کہ وہاں پہ چلتے تھے CIA کے. ہمیں یہ پتہ ہے کہ آسٹریلین وار کرائمز کے اوپر ایک بریٹن رپورٹ آئی تھی جس کے اندر انہوں نے 35 جو ایک ہی رات کے اندر افغانس کو انہوں نے مارا تھا. پھر کندہار ماسکر اس کے علاوہ تھا. اس کے علاوہ ڈرونز صرف 400 سے 500 ڈرون صرف پاکستان کے ٹرائبل بیلٹس کے اندر ہوئے تھے. امیجن دا اماؤنٹ آف ڈرونز بین کیریڈ آؤٹ, ڈرون اٹیکس بین کیریڈ آؤٹ ان سائڈ افغانستان. تو یہ تمام وہ چیزیں تھیں جو پائل اپ ہو رہی تھیں, اور اس کی وجہ سے پھر ہم دیکھتے ہیں کہ 15 اگست کو طالبان مارچ انٹو کابل وداؤٹ اینی اسپیسیفک ریزسٹنس, بیکاز اس وقت تک اور پھر گوسٹ آرمی اور اس طرح کی بہت ساری چیزیں وہ آلریڈی یو ہیو بین ہرڈ اینڈ یو نو انڈرسٹینڈ کہ اس وقت وہاں پہ کیا ہو رہا تھا. اکاؤنٹیبلٹی کا مسئلہ تھا, انفراسٹرکچر کا میں بتا چکا ہوں. ہیوملیشن یہ افغان سائیکی کے لیے بڑا امپورٹنٹ ہے. when you interact with Afghans, they are a very prideful nation, اور ہیوملیشن ان کے ہاں برداشت نہیں کی جاتی ایون وین یو انٹریکٹ نارملی ود دیم. امبیسڈر سعدی صاحب کے ساتھ ہم پچھلے دنوں ایک سیشن میں تھے, انہوں نے بڑی اچھی بات کی کہ کباب ڈپلومیسی وہاں پہ چلتی ہے. یعنی آپ ان کے ساتھ بیٹھے ہیں, ان کے ساتھ بات کریں, ان کے ساتھ آپ انٹریکٹ کریں ٹیبل کے اوپر, دے ول لو یو. لیکن اگر آپ ان کو ہیوملیٹ کریں گے تو وہ چاہے کسی بھی قسم کا افغان ہو وہ اس کو ریٹیلیٹ کرے گا. اینڈ وین وی سی کہ جب بھی کوئی امریکن پریزیڈنٹ بگرام کے اوپر اترتے تھے, they used to call the Afghan president to the Bagram Airways, اور وہ وہاں پر آ کے سوائے کرزئی صاحب میرا خیال انہوں نے ایک دفعہ جو ہے وہ انکار کیا تھا, اس کے علاوہ ہمیشہ ان کو وہاں پہ بلایا جاتا. لاسٹ پکچر دیٹ کیم آؤٹ فرام بگرام واز کہ ٹرمپ جو ہے وہ غنی کو پیٹ کر رہے ہیں بیک کے اوپر, اور وہ جا کے امریکن سولجر کے ساتھ کھڑے ہوں گے. دس واز a kind of humiliating picture for the Afghans themselves. So this all nurtured a kind of narrative which then resulted into the easy takeover, I would rather say, of Afghan Taliban of the Afghanistan. Takeover کے بعد کیا ہوا? I will quickly come to that now. امبیسڈر صاحب نے بہت اچھے طریقے سے بہت ساری چیزیں بیان کر دی ہوئی ہیں. جو چیلنجز اور اپرچونیٹیز ان کے پاس موجود ہیں وہ بھی ڈسکس ہوئی ہیں. میں کچھ پرسپیکٹیو جو وہاں پہ اس وقت پریویلنگ ہے اس کے بارے میں بات کروں گا. دیر آر سرٹن کائنڈ آف پیپل اوور دیئر. پہلے تو وہ لوگ ہیں جو کہ کسی نہ کسی طریقے سے اس جو پچھلے 20 سال کا سسٹم تھا اس کا حصہ تھے. They were either running the NGOs or INGOs, they were either the part of the government or they were working with the allied forces. So ان کے ہاں ایک ڈر اور خوف ہے. There was a fear factor among them that whenever Taliban will take over, وہ ان سے ایک ریونج لیں گے. اس کی وجہ سے انہوں نے پہلی فرصت کے اندر یہ بہتر جانا کہ وہ افغانستان کو چھوڑ کے چلیں گے. دس از دا فرسٹ جو ایک لیئر ہے وہاں پہ لوگوں کی. سیکنڈ لیئر از obviously those people who foresaw کہ افغانستان میں طالبان کے آنے کی وجہ سے ایک اکنامک کرنچ یا اکنامک سینکشنز کا معاملہ آئے گا, اور اس کی وجہ سے ہمیں یہاں پہ جو جاب اپرچونیٹیز ہیں وہ ہمارے لیے سیچوریٹ ہو جائیں گے. سو وی نیڈ ٹو فلائی آؤٹ آف دا کنٹری. تو دوسرا آپ کو وہ چنک نظر آتا ہے. اس وقت پاکستان کے اندر تقریباً پچھلے ایک سال کے اندر 4,30,000 کے قریب جو لوگ ہیں وہ افغانستان سے آ چکے ہیں, اور اس کے اندر سے کچھ جو ہیں وہ صرف اور صرف ان کے جو تذکرہ یا نارمل جو ڈاکومنٹس ہوتے ہیں اس کے اوپر ہیں. سر یہ لاسٹ 1 ایئر کے اندر جی. سو 430,000 اسٹیگرنگ اماؤنٹ, یعنی ایک بہت بڑی فگر ہے صرف یہ بتانے کے لیے کہ اس وقت افغانستان کی وہ لیئر جو کہ کسی نہ کسی طریقے سے افغانستان کی ری بلڈنگ کے اندر ایک کنٹریبیوشن کر سکتی تھی وہ کس طرح افغانستان سے باہر جانے کا سوچ رہی ہے. تھرڈ جو کہ افغانستان کے اندر ہی ہیں یا تو ان کو باہر جانے کا موقع نہیں مل رہا, اور اس کے اندر بہت ساری پالیسیز افغانستان کے طالبان جو انٹرم گورنمنٹ ہے ان کی بھی ہیں, انہوں نے بہت ساری ایسے پالیسیز امپلیمنٹ کی ہوئی ہیں اس وقت افغانستان کے اندر. فار ایگزامپل ایک چھوٹی سی پالیسی میں بتاتا ہوں کہ اگر آپ پاسپورٹ لینا چاہیں گے اس وقت افغانستان کے اندر تو دا کاسٹ آف پاسپورٹ آئی تھنک از $2,000 جو کہ آپ کو پے کرنی پڑتی ہے وہاں پہ. پاکستان کے اندر آپ چلے جائیں تو میرا خیال ہے ایک ارجنٹ پاسپورٹ بھی آپ کو 8-10 ہزار روپے میں مل جاتا ہے, لیکن وہاں پہ $2,000 اس لیے امپلیمنٹ کیا گیا تاکہ لوگ جو ہیں وہ ڈسکریج ہوں اور وہ پاسپورٹ کو وہ نہ بنائیں اور پھر وہ باہر کی طرف کا رخ نہ کریں. سو طالبان کو بھی اس چیز کا کہیں نہ کہیں احساس ہے کہ جو یہ برین ڈرین ہے اس کو کسی نہ کسی طریقے سے ہم نے روکنا ہے افغانستان سے باہر جانے سے. اس کی وجہ سے یہ جو 3 میں نے آپ کو لیئرز بتائی ہیں, اس کے باوجود افغان طالبان جو ہیں انہوں نے کوشش کی ہے کہ وہ کسی طریقے سے اکوموڈیٹ کریں. یہ کرٹیسزم تو بہرحال ان کے اوپر ہو رہی ہے اور اس کے اوپر مسلسل میڈیا کے اوپر بھی بات ہو رہی ہے, لیکن جو نہیں دکھایا جا رہا وہ ان کے کچھ ایفرٹس ہیں جو کہ انہوں نے کوشش کی ہے کہ ہم کر سکیں افغانستان کے اندر. فار ایگزامپل پہلی چیز انہوں نے یہ کی ہے کہ they understood this that they cannot run the country with their ranks and files جو کہ ان کے پاس اس وقت کیڈر ہے, کیونکہ those people were disconnected from the urban Afghanistan for past 20 years. They were in war. They only know کہ انہوں نے گن کیسے چلانی ہے, they only know کہ انہوں نے سیکورٹی کو کیسے مینٹین کرنا ہے, but they do not know کہ انہوں نے گورننس کیسے کرنی ہے. کچھ ان کے بڑے جو ہیں وہ ظاہر جانتے ہیں ان چیزوں کو. So what they did is کہ انہوں نے منسٹریز کے اندر جو منسٹریل پوسٹ ہیں, ڈپٹی منسٹریل پوسٹ ہیں یا ڈائریکٹوریل پوسٹ جو ہوتی ہیں وہ انہوں نے طالبان کے حوالے کر دی ہیں. اس کے علاوہ انہوں نے نیچے جتنی بھی بیوروکریسی ہے یہ وہی 6 لاکھ لوگ ہیں جو کہ پچھلی گورنمنٹ کے اندر موجود تھے اور وہ اس وقت وہاں پہ سرو کر رہے ہیں. بٹ دا ایشو از کہ ان کے یہ جو 6 لاکھ لوگ ہیں اور جو طالبان ہیں ان کے اندر بھی ایک ٹرسٹ ڈیفیسٹ اس وقت موجود ہے. اینڈ دیٹ از دا ریزن کہ اس کی بہت ساری ہمیں وہاں پہ ایگزامپلس ملتی ہیں. اس کی ایک ایگزامپل یہ ہے کہ پاکستان نے جیسے ہی طالبان آئے تو اس کے اگلے مہینے پاکستان نے سجیسٹ کیا, اس سے پہلے خیر یہ بات چل رہی تھی بٹ دین پاکستان تھروٹل کہ یار ایک پاکستان افغانستان بس دوستی سروس جو ہے اس کا آغاز کیا جائے. وہ متقی صاحب تک بھی پہنچ گئی, اس کے بعد پھر وہ فارن آفس کے اندر بھی چلتی رہی. بٹ دیٹ سمپل ڈیسیجن جو کہ پاکستان کی طرف سے فائنل ہو چکا تھا, دیٹ ٹک آلموسٹ لائک 7-8 months ٹو فائنلائز ایٹ دیئر پارٹ, کیونکہ ان کے ہاں ڈیسیژن میکنگ پروسیس جو انڈیسائسونیس جو ہے وہ بہت زیادہ ہے اس وقت. سو دے ڈو ناٹ انڈرسٹینڈ کہ انہوں نے کس چیز پہ ڈیسیژن لینا اور کس چیز پہ ڈیسیژن نہیں لینا, وہ اس وقت ایک مخمسے کا شکار ہیں. تو یہ وہ تمام چیزیں ہیں جو کہ اس وقت وہاں پہ ہمیں نظر آتی ہیں. فسکل بجٹ انہوں نے اس وقت نکالا تھا لاسٹ ایئر کا 320 بلین افغانی روپی, جو کہ انہوں نے صرف ٹرانزٹ ٹریڈ اور اس طرح کی جو دوسری چھوٹی موٹی ٹریڈ ہیں اس سے جو انہوں نے اکٹھے کیے پیسے اس کے بنیاد کے اوپر انہوں نے ایک فسکل بجٹ جو اناؤنس کیا تھا, جو کہ ان کی بہت بڑی کامیابی گردانی جا رہی تھی. اس وقت بہرحال اکنامک اینڈ کے اوپر وہ بہرحال کچھ انہوں نے ان روڈز بنا لیے ہیں, چونکہ ڈیفیکٹو ریکگنیشن ان کی بہرحال موجود ہے. تو چائنیز جو ہیں وہ انہوں نے اپنی ایک ان روڈز وہاں پہ بنائی بڑی انڈر دا ریڈار. فار ایگزامپل وہاں پہ ایک ہوٹل ہے کابل اسٹار از ون آف دا سیکنڈ لارجسٹ اور تھرڈ لارجسٹ ہوٹل ان کابل. اس کو اس وقت چائنیز جو ہے وہ لیز پہ لے لیا. اور اس کے علاوہ ان کی ایک ہے میسینک ایک جگہ ہے جہاں پہ کاپر کی ان کی بہت بڑی مائنس ہیں. تو چائنا نے وہاں پہ انویسٹمنٹ کی اور چائنا وہاں پہ ان کو اس کے رائٹس انہوں نے چائنیز نے لے لیے. دے ول بی مائننگ اوور دیئر. ابھی 2-3 دن پہلے انہوں نے رشینس کے ساتھ تقریباً 1 بلین گیس اور آئل سپلائی کا جو ہے وہ معاہدہ کیا, اور وہ ابھی وہاں سے بھی گیس اور آئل جو ہے وہ پیٹرولیم پروڈکٹس جو ہیں وہاں سے وہ لے کر آئیں گے. سو دس ٹیلز اس کہ وہ کسی نہ کسی طریقے سے دے آر اسٹرگلنگ بٹ دے آر ٹرائنگ کہ وہ کسی نہ کسی طریقے سے ان ساری اپرچونیٹیز کو بھی کیش کر سکیں. ناؤ یہ جتنی اپرچونیٹیز میں آپ کو بتا رہا ہوں یہ پھر بھی کچھ نہیں ہے جب when it comes down to پاکستان کے ساتھ ان کے تقریباً 4 پاسز ایکٹیو تھے ہمارے ساتھ پورے بارڈر کے اوپر, لیکن ابھی 12 کے قریب ہم نے پاسز جو ہیں وہ ایکٹیو کر دیے ہیں اور 16 کے قریب پاسز اور ایکٹیو کرنے جا رہے ہیں. اور یہ پاسز صرف جی کراسنگس they will be mainly used for the trade purposes. اس میں سے 3 تو ایسے ہیں جو کہ پیڈسٹرینس کے لیے بھی یوز ہوں گے, لیکن باقی جو ہیں وہ ٹریڈ پرپسز کے لیے یوز ہوں گے. ابھی پاکستان نے یہ بھی ڈیسائیڈ کیا ہے, صرف ایک میں ایگزامپل آپ کو دوں گا, اور اس میں یہ ہے کہ کول جو ہے وہ پاکستان نے ڈیسائیڈ کیا کہ 30,000 ٹن کول آن پر ڈے بیسس وی ول بی امپورٹنگ فرام افغانستان. اور پاکستان نے یہ ڈیسیژن اس لیے لیا تاکہ ان کی اکانومی کو بھی کچھ نہ کچھ فائدہ ہو اور ہم بھی جو ہماری نیڈس ہیں کول کی اور انرجی کی, اس کو ادھر سے ہی پورا کر سکیں. دیٹ اماؤنٹس ٹو اراؤنڈ 20 بلین افغانی روپیز پر ایئر, جو کہ ہم ان کو ان کی اکانومی کے اندر پے کریں گے. دیٹ از آلموسٹ ایکولنٹ ٹو 90% آف ٹوٹل افغان فسکل بجٹ جو کہ ابھی افغان طالبان نے ڈکلیئر کیا تھا. تو یہ تمام اپرچونیٹیز بھی ان کے سامنے ہیں, چیلنجز کے اوپر آلریڈی, اور جو ایشوز انکلوسیوٹی کے ہیں وہ آلریڈی وہی ہیں جو کہ امبیسڈر صاحب نے بتا دی, تو میں ان کو ریپیٹ نہیں کروں گا. جسٹ ایک چیز, پکتیکا کے اندر جو ابھی انہوں نے اسکول کھولا تھا, اس کے بعد انہوں نے انویسٹیگیشن شروع کر دی ہے. تو اس کے بعد انہوں نے کہا جی ذبیح اللہ مجاہد صاحب کا بیان آیا کہ وی ہیو اسٹارٹڈ اور انویسٹیگیشن اینڈ وی ول سی کہ ہو ہیز ٹیکن دس اسٹیپ. Nobody can open the schools until the higher education will say so. یہ ان کے لوکل کمانڈرز جو وہاں پر گورنرز ہیں انہوں نے کیا تھا. بٹ اس کے بعد یہ ہوا کہ کل رات کو آئی تھنک ایک اور علاقہ ہے, اس کا نام مجھے یاد نہیں, وہاں بھی انہوں نے اسکول کھول دیے. لیکن اس کے علاوہ کچھ ایسے ان کے پروونسز ضرور موجود ہیں جہاں پہ سیکنڈری اسکولس جو ہیں وہ چل رہے ہیں لڑکیوں کے, اور وہ طالبان کی ہی اجازت سے چل رہے ہیں, لیکن وہ جب تک ریڈار پہ نہیں آتے تب تک اس کو چلنے دیتے ہیں. ایز سون ایز اٹ کمز آن ٹو دا میڈیا they go for the crackdown. جو طالبان کے اپنے اندر رینکس اینڈ فائلز میں شدید اس وقت ایک تنقید ہے صرف اس ایک بات پہ, اور بھی بہت ساری ہیں, لیکن اس ایک گرلز ایجوکیشن والے مسئلے کے اوپر. اور اس کی وجہ یہ ہے کہ ان کو بھی پتہ ہے کہ ان کی جو ریکگنیشن کا ایشو ہے دیٹ ہیز بین ہوکڈ بائی دس سنگل آسپیکٹ, کہ جب تک وہ گرلز ایجوکیشن کا مسئلہ ریزالو نہیں کریں گے وہ ریکگنیشن کی طرف نہیں جا سکیں گے. اینڈ دس از ون آف دا مین ریزنس کہ اس وقت اگر آپ ایون سوشل میڈیا کے اوپر جائیں, ادھر بھی چیٹر پڑھیں, جو پرو طالبان اکاؤنٹس ہیں ایون دے کرٹیسائز طالبان کہ وہ کیوں گرلز ایجوکیشن کے معاملے کے اوپر جو ہے وہ انہوں نے اتنا اسٹرکٹ سٹانس لیا. لیکن وہ 4-5 لوگ ہیں جو کہ کندہار کے اندر بیٹھے ہیں اور وہ اس چیز کو نہیں آگے بڑھنے دے رہے. سو دس از فرام مائی سائڈ سر. میں چونکہ ٹائم کم تھا تو میں نے اس لیے جلدی بات کر دیا. ایک چیز میں تھوڑی سی یہاں پہ کہنا چاہوں گا, جو ٹی ٹی پی اور بی ایل اے کا ایشو ہے وہ جیسے مرسد صاحب نے کہا کہ ان کے ساتھ نیگوسیشن بی ایل اے کے اوپر انہوں نے کریک ڈاؤن کیا ہے, جو میں وہاں پہ جا کے بات کی تھی, آبزرو کیا تھا. لیکن ٹی ٹی پی کے اوپر ان کا ایک بہرحال سافٹ کارنر موجود ہے, ان کو انہوں نے پروٹیکٹ بھی کیا ہوا ہے. ابھی جب میں میرے ایک کولیگ ہیں وہ ابھی افغانستان گئے تھے, he met certain high profiles over there. I would not name them over here کیونکہ اس کے وہ ہے, لیکن they were on the top, اور انہوں نے ان کو یہ انشور کرایا, بلکہ کچھ چیزیں بھی دکھائیں گی جس کے مطابق انہوں نے بی ایل اے کے اوپر کافی کام کیا ہے وہاں پہ. بٹ ٹی ٹی پی is something which is a bone of contention between Pakistan and Afghanistan. تو اس کے اوپر ابھی شاید پاکستان جو ہے وہ ایک ڈیلیگیشن بھیجے گا اور ان سے بھی نیگوشیٹ کرے گا آن اے ویری ہائی لیول, اور اس کو جا کے شاید بھی پروسیڈنگس ہوں گی. آخری چیز جو ہے وہ میں صرف ادھر ایک بات کرنا چاہوں گا, جو ریزنٹمنٹس ہیں افغانستان کے اندر, یہ ہم جب افغانستان کے ساتھ ڈیل کرتے ہیں, یہ جیسے امبیسڈر ابرار حسین صاحب نے کہا کہ ایک ہسٹوریکل لیگیسی ہے, تو پاکستان کے اندر اکیڈیمیا کے ڈسکورس کے اندر یہ ایک چیز مسنگ ہے, اینڈ دس شوڈ بی ڈیلیورڈ ریگولرسلی. اور وہ یہ ہے کہ افغانستان کے اندر یہ چیز پروپوگیٹ کی گئی ہے کہ پاکستان ایک برٹش پروجیکٹ ہے, اٹ از اے لیگیسی آف اے برٹش پروجیکٹ. سو دس شوڈ بی ایڈریسڈ. until unless we will not address this, یہ چیز جو ہے مسلسل جو ہے وہ وہاں پہ ایک ریزنٹمنٹ اور ایک فالٹ لائن کے طور پہ موجود رہے گی, اور اس کو وہ لوگ یوز کرتے رہیں گے ہمارے خلاف. جی یہ ان کے, کیونکہ انفارچونیٹلی باچا خان صاحب جب تھے انہوں نے بھی یہ بات کہی تھی. یہ سر ان کے جتنے بھی آپ اگر ان کے لٹریچر اٹھائیں, پشتو لٹریچر اسپیشلی اگر آپ ان کا اٹھائیں, تو وہاں پہ یہ چیز بدرجہ تھم پائی جاتی ہے. تھینک یو سو مچ سر.
اوکے جی. Thank you, sir. This brings us to the end of discussion on first sub-theme. Before moving on to second sub-theme, I'll just briefly comment about 2-3 things which were raised by my friend, Mr. Salman Javed. Brain drain, yes, it's a problem there. But then the way Taliban is handling it is not advisable. I mean, you can't stop people from flying out of the country by force. Like they have enhanced the cost of passport. In fact, they also advised our embassy at one stage to issue less number of visas to Afghans. They were not worried about the issue of visas to foreigners, but issue of visa to Afghans meant that they would be brain drained. So the real thing is that there should be persuasive manner. They should try to encourage those people to live within Afghanistan. The environment should be such that people don't go out of the country just because of such laws of such government or such bad governance. The second thing, he spoke about mineral resources of Afghanistan, about Miss Ainak. Yes, Miss Ainak is a copper mine, a huge one. And in fact, Chinese had a contract with the Afghan government, which was signed in 2008. But it couldn't be implemented because of the problems of security and corruption during the last two governments, Hamid Karzai's government and then Ashraf Ghani's government. And now those issues have been addressed to a large extent. And now Chinese perhaps can come back. And Taliban have also said that they would honor, they would respect that agreement. But then Taliban have huge mineral resources. According to an estimate, the mineral resources in Afghanistan are worth $3 trillion. Many of them are untapped, yes. There is iron ore in Hajigak, again, a huge mine. And many foreigners are approaching Afghans to have some deal about those mineral resources. About, yes, and lithium, of course. They have huge reservoirs of lithium as well. Imports, Pakistani imports from Afghanistan. Yes, this time we have imported coal, and recently we have imported tomatoes and onions. I think 400 plus trucks have brought these items from Afghanistan to Pakistan. So this will benefit Taliban government as well, and it's a mutual trade. But for the first time in history, the balance of trade is in Afghanistan's favor. Previously, the bilateral trade went up to $2.5 billion at one time. Then it came down to $1.5 billion. After the foreign withdrawal, of course, there were so many reasons it came down. But right now, the Pakistani exports are around 700 million, and Afghan imports from Afghanistan are more than 700 million. So it's again $1.5 billion roughly, but the balance of trade is in Afghanistan's favor. Well, with this, we move on to the second sub-theme, which is Afghanistan's humanitarian and economic challenges. And we have very learned speakers for this sub-theme as well. Mr. Hassan Khan is a very famous journalist and an expert on Afghan affairs. First, I'll request him to give his remarks. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Brother Salman Bhai, and the audience. I think before coming to the topic, which is economic and humanitarian challenges faced by the current Afghanistan, you're talking about this, the Taliban project, like the inclusivity government, etc. So unfortunately, in Afghanistan for the last almost 40 years, we have governments came under various accords, starting from Geneva. So Geneva was different accords than the Peshawar Accord, and then we have the Bonn Accord, and then we have the Doha Accord. So all were exclusive accords. It's not only the Doha Accord, which is exclusive of the others. In Peshawar Accord, which I think constructed with the efforts of Pakistan, so we have only the 9 or no sitare the ya 7 sitare the, sir. So it was the government of those 7 or 8 Mujahideen commanders. Then we have the Bonn Accords. Again, the international community was involved. So again, Bone Accord was not an inclusive. The government which came under the Bone Accord, it was not an inclusive government. We keep Taliban and those who were disliked by the international community out of that government, the first government which was formed by President Karzai. And now we have the Doha Accord. So again, Doha Accord is I think it is exact following the steps which are of the Bonn Accords and the Peshawar Accords and close to the Geneva Accords. So I think blaming only Afghan Taliban for the inclusivity or the exclusivity factors, I think we need to also look into the other government for the last came during the last 20 or plus years. So this is the Afghan character. And I think this is the way the international communities are looking at Afghan, or how to handle or how to deal the Afghan situations in for the last 4 decades. So that is, I think, which I want to make those comments. I think at the moment, since August 2021, when Taliban took over, I think the Afghanistan is faced with the crisis, with the problems, with the challenges. So far, hardly we can count any opportunities which are there. Only one opportunities, and that is the I think the restoration of somehow peace and security, improving the security situation in the entire Afghanistan. Lately, we see the terrorist activity, especially carried out by Daesh and other terrorist networks, but they are very sporadic. Not the one which existed before 2021. So that's the only thing we can say, that Afghanistan is somehow, there is a security situation is improved, or the peace is somehow improved, and the threat to that imminent threat, or the existence threat to the regional countries or to the internationals, that has been reduced to a certain level. As for when the US, the former president, Dr. Ashraf Ghani, when he was in power, so I think it said that 75% of the budget allocations were dependent on the donors or the foreign money, 75%. So on 15th August 2021, when Taliban took over, so that 75% is stopped. Even the $2 billion, which were already released by the international donors and for paying the salaries, particularly of the education and health staff and other essential services, they were stopped on the very way before reaching to Afghanistan. So the day Taliban took over, so everything, the curtain was down from the donors or the international community and the international aid. So the teachers, we saw when Taliban took over, so the biggest problem was to paying the salaries for teachers and for the health and other essential staffs, including the government services. So I think, let me say it, at the moment, the humanitarian crisis in Afghanistan are because of the decision taken by the governments, taken by the international community. The government means including the Taliban government, because the way they are dealing with the situation, the emerging situation, whether it is the US, the UN, or the regional countries, or whether it is which is the Kabul government or the Taliban regime, the way they are dealing with it, I think they are in no mood to resolve this issue. It seems that there is an efforts going on to perpetuate the crisis situation in Afghanistan. This is my personal observation. And that's why in most of my presentations, whenever in my talks, I say that God forbid if Afghanistan is going into this descent, the current speed, I think there will be a chaos, and there will be a much bigger chaos in Afghanistan in the coming year. So economic crisis, first, the US sanctions, which were imposed on Taliban back in 1998, when Al-Qaeda hit US embassies in African countries. So then certain sanctions were imposed on the Taliban individual or on the Taliban group. The day Taliban took over the government, those sanctions which were to be on the Taliban, individual, they automatically were, I will use the word translated into being sanctioned on the Afghan government, on the Afghan government entities, in the, I think it's on Afghanistan, we'll say on Afghanistan. Though these totally technical issues. The Afghan Bank, which is the name, the Afghan Bank is the Bank of Afghanistan. It was, I think, delisted, and it was what you call it, cut off from the international banking sectors. So what happened? You isolated Afghanistan. You are punishing the US and the international community, the UN too. It is punishing the Afghans for the acts of Taliban since 2 decades. As I said, the sanctions begins from 1998 when Al-Qaeda bombers had US embassies in Tanzania and Sudan somewhere. So you cut off the Afghan bank from the international banking system. So what happened? The money, the flow of money, or the inflow or the outflow of money is totally stopped. The Afghan bank reserve, the Afghan reserves, and the international reserves like the New York Federal Reserve or the London Federal Reserve, they were also not confiscated, but Afghans and the government were deprived of getting that money because there was no channel to get it. So what happened? There was a huge shortage of what we call it cash currencies, bank notes, you call it, whether it is Afghan banks, Afghanis, or whether it was a dollar. So whoever is visiting Kabul in these days, he will see the markets full of food items. He will see the markets, the shops full of goods, but there will be no buyer for it because people don't have the money. 1. 2, what happened? Such a chaos was created that most of the technical people, like Salman talked about the brain drain, the technical people, whether it was in the banking sector, whether it was in the government sector, the health sector, or the education sector, they just tried to fly away from Afghanistan. And most of them succeeded. He said the 400,000 people who are currently in Peshawar and Islamabad or elsewhere in Pakistan, these are not those Afghans who were refugees to Pakistan. These are the well-off Afghan families, because out of you, whosoever is living in Islamabad in the rented houses or in the rented flats, they know it very well that for the last 1 or more year, the rates in Islamabad are more than double. The flat which are available for 20,000 or 25,000, you can't get that flats even the 50,000 and 60,000, because most of the Afghan families currently shifted to Pakistan, they are the middle class or the upper middle class or the upper class families. So they can afford living in a very good houses or living lavishly in Islamabad, Lahore, Peshawar or Karachi. So this was shortage, and to the major of this crisis, the major victims were women and children. Because I myself belong to, let's say, there is a Pashtun society, even in tribal society, whether it is a Punjabi, Sindhis, or any tribal structure, women and children are considered as the second or the third category or rate, I think, members of the family. The first, it is the male, is the younger boys, and then it is the female. So in Afghanistan at the moment, I was reading a report of the Save the Children and World Health Organization that almost 90% of the families are facing food shortages, and 7.5 million children in Afghanistan at the moment, they are unable to get two times of meals. So it is leading to a major food malnutrition. So who are suffering the most? I was reading in that reports that for families, it is a hard decision to take whom to feed among their siblings, among their kids. So you have to feed your son, either you have to feed your daughter. So as I said, it is a tribal structure, it is a tribal society. So in a tribal society, men lead the the rest of the family, like in a sister and a brother, the parents of the child, if they go to the brothers, they select the male and try the women. वैसे भी ठीक है, अब तो खातून पराये घर की है, क्योंकि नॉर्मली हमारे यहाँ ये एक बोला जाता है। इवन आप सबके घरों में भी अगर आप देखें तो माएँ जो होती है या दादियाँ नानियाँ जो होती है, लड़कियों के बारे में यही कहते हैं कि वैसे भी तो पराये घर की है, तो इसलिए लड़कों को ज्यादा प्रेफरेंस दिया जाता है, फौकियत दी जाती है। तो दे आर सो यू आर व्हाई आई एम मेकिंग दिस पॉइंट that you are totally crippling down the coming generation, the next generation, because mothers are malnourished, young girls are malnourished, they are deprived of education, they are deprived of healthcare facilities. So the very next generations, it will have a very longer impact on the next generation. So let me make it short. Out of the current trade, there are certain, what we call it, perceptions or misperceptions. Like there is a trade between Pakistan and Afghanistan. For more than a month, the coal export or import from Afghanistan is, it is no more. It is, what you call it, is stopped. It is suspended for more than a month or a month and a half. And two, as Ambassador Ebrar Saab has said, that there is a trade imbalance. Pakistan export to Afghanistan and Pakistan imports from Afghanistan. Look, there is no banking channel. Is there any data available that how much money is going back to Afghanistan? If you are importing a container of coal, how the money is going back to Afghanistan? No money, sir, is going back to Afghanistan. Yes, so one was making this point that besides men and the brain drain, the available money, dollars, which were with the people, that is also draining out of the country. Because anything exported to Pakistan or Iran, it is done through hawalas, done through the Sarafa system. So that money is not going, because most of the people are trying to get their money out of Afghanistan to resettle, whether in Pakistan or in Iran. So let me conclude it here at the point that the situation in Afghanistan is really is very much what you call it, disturbing. It's the humanitarian crisis it's already there. It's not looming large. It is already there. And I think if the current situation is continued and the international community and even the Afghan leadership, they didn't pay attention to it. So I think the future seems to be very bleak, sir. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Hassan Khan Saab. Due to paucity of time, I'll immediately move on to our next speaker. Ms. Heather Barr is Associate Director of Women's Rights Division at Human Rights Watch. She will address us online. The floor is yours.
Thank you, sir. And hi, good morning to all of you. I'm sorry I'm not able to join you in person. I was living in Islamabad until about a month ago, but my family has moved now, so I'm afraid it's down to the miracle of Zoom. Thanks for inviting me for this discussion, and thanks for this important discussion. It's been interesting to listen in. I work for a human rights organization. I'm going to talk about, these issues from a human rights perspective, of course. And from our perspective, the people in Afghanistan are facing two very serious crises at the same time. One of them, of course, is the economic and humanitarian crisis. And we've been very critical of countries, particularly the United States, that have contributed to that crisis, although we also believe that the Taliban are playing a very unhelpful role. But the other crisis, of course, is a human rights crisis involving abuses by the Taliban against the Afghan people, as well as ongoing attacks by ISKP, which some people have mentioned. So I want to talk briefly about both of those crises. because I think that they have to be dealt with at the same time in a way that that sort of balances the attention that both require, and that navigates carefully in a way that puts the safety and well-being of the Afghan people first in all decision making, and recognizes that both of these dynamics are happening at the same time, and both of them are harming Afghan people very, very seriously. I mean, we've already heard some of the statistics about the level of hunger in Afghanistan. This is a shocking and horrible issue, and we know that winter is coming again before long. The statistics on child malnutrition are shocking, and this is one of this is the worst humanitarian crisis in the world right now, and we know that a country cannot stay afloat on humanitarian aid. We also know that there's fatigue among donors, and that the humanitarian assistance will be unlikely to continue at high levels. The levels have never been adequate anyway to meet the need, and there's no substitute for having a functioning economic system. So Human Rights Watch has found itself in a fairly unusual situation of educating ourselves quickly about central banks and liquidity and things like that, and doing a lot of advocacy, particularly through our Washington, D.C. office on this issue. And we've pushed very hard and been very critical of the United States for we've felt for many months not an adequate sense of urgency about resolving the economic issues, the issues about recognition of the central bank, the issues about the reserves. We've been critical about the decision to set aside some of the reserves for potential court awards to 9/11 victims, and so on. I have to say also, though, that the Taliban have been very resistant to finding solutions to this problem, and the last speaker alluded to this. It's not unusual for a central bank to face oversight. I think Pakistan is familiar with some of these challenges as well, and the Taliban simply don't seem to be willing to compromise on this or many other issues, and they seem to be fairly comfortable watching their own people starve to death because of their own inflexibility on this issue. I think there are solutions available that could put in place international oversight. It doesn't have to be oversight by the United States. It could be oversight, it could be negotiated, could be figured out, like what type of oversight, what country providing oversight would be seen as neutral. But it hasn't been possible to reach agreement on that. And unfortunately, the consequences of that will be death for Afghan people. I want to talk about the human rights crisis. This is a very, very serious and shocking and actually escalating crisis. So others have talked about the women's rights crisis. I'll talk about that in a moment, but it's not just about women's rights. There's been a long string of extrajudicial killings. The Taliban's promise of amnesty for those who were part of the previous government has not been true. The targets of extrajudicial killings have mostly been people associated with the previous government, particularly with the security forces. There's been a massive crackdown on media freedom in Afghanistan. As you know, Afghanistan had quite a flourishing national media over the last 20 years. That's largely been silenced. The Taliban are forcing journalists, for example, to have their articles approved by the intelligence service before publishing them sometimes. They've detained and tortured journalists. They've, in many places, driven women journalists out of working entirely. There are many provinces that now have no working women journalists. I mean, we know about the attacks on the Hazara and Shia communities. Human Rights Watch has written about this recently. There have been at least 13 attacks since the Taliban took over, attributed to ISKP, and with 700 people, at least 700 people injured or killed in those attacks. And those attacks are ongoing. And one of the challenges for those communities is that they don't feel that the Taliban will do anything to protect them or to support them in the wake of such attacks, because The Taliban themselves, of course, have engaged in abuses in the past against those communities. The justice sector is not really functioning. Like, rule of law is not really in place in Afghanistan. The courts are not functioning properly. Cases are decided extrajudicially. People are detained without any due process. And then, of course, we have to talk about the women's rights situation. No country in the world has been prepared to defend the Taliban's behavior toward women and girls. And it's not just about excluding them from the government, which they are, of course, completely excluded from, but it's every aspect of women's lives and girls' lives. Secondary education remains banned in a de facto manner under the Taliban. Women are banned from working in most occupations. The Taliban systematically dismantled the system that had been put in place over many years with enormous effort to respond to gender-based violence. Women are facing massive new barriers to accessing healthcare. Part of that is because of the humanitarian and economic crisis, but part of it is because of Taliban restrictions, such as saying that women can't be treated by male healthcare professionals, and in some places requiring women to have a mahram in order to go to a healthcare appointment. So, and then we have to talk about freedom of movement as well. The Taliban's order on May 8th that women should cover their faces when in public, but saying that actually the best form of hijab is not to leave your house at all, and women should not leave their houses unless they have a good reason for doing so, and that if women violate that order, the punishment will not be against them, but against their male family member. Without freedom of movement, you can't enjoy any of your other rights, including education, employment, etc. So this is the most serious women's rights crisis in the world right now. This is the most serious women's rights crisis since the Taliban took over the last time in 1996. And as I said a moment ago, there's no country in the world that is imposing these types of abuses on women or that's prepared to defend these abuses. And one of the strategies that I think a lot of countries looked to early on in the international community to deal with the Taliban was the idea that Islamic countries and Muslim majority countries could play a really important role in talking with the Taliban and saying to them, look, this is not required under Islam. This is not how women are treated in the 21st century. This strategy, as far as I can tell, has failed completely, because the Taliban seem to be entirely comfortable feeling that they're the only people on the planet who understand Islam, and that their particular extremist view of Islam is the only correct one. I think that the role of Muslim majority and Islamic countries is still incredibly important, because it sends a message to the Taliban that there will not be solidarity with them as long as they're engaging in these abuses, and that they will be isolated. But it's important in that way, not in the sense that it seems like it's going to change their minds, because nothing seems to be able to change their minds at this point. I think, one of the things that we've seen over the last year is the US really sort of stepping away from this very dominant role that the US played over the last 20 years in Afghanistan. And that's left a bit of a vacuum in terms of who in the international community is actually kind of taking a lead on addressing these two crises. We've sort of tried to talk to countries that say that they have a feminist foreign policy about what their role should be in dealing with the women's rights crisis that's happening. Other countries, as I said, have looked to the OIC and to neighboring countries. And I think that vacuum, that void hasn't been filled, to be honest, so far. There isn't a clear strategy. There isn't clear leadership. There isn't a coordinated effort by the international community to respond to either of these crises. And that is to the detriment of the Afghan people and the region, of course. I want to just to say quickly, about Afghans in Pakistan. I mean, this is a huge issue. Obviously, I would not agree with the characterization that Afghans are living a lavish lifestyle in Pakistan. That may be true for some people, but I'm still receiving calls and messages every day from people who have no food to eat because they are trying to survive in Pakistan, often undocumented, without the ability to work, without the ability actually to secure housing. They can't even have a SIM card if they don't have a valid visa. And so I think this is a huge crisis. And we have recognized in the past and in the present that the burden on countries in the region of supporting Afghan refugees is not fair, and that other countries have not done their duty in terms of honoring the 1951 Refugee Convention and taking in Afghans. We've been very, very critical of countries such as the UK and the US and others that have had processes for resettling Afghans that have been incredibly bureaucratic and slow and dysfunctional. Processes that have favored men over women by, for example, prioritizing military interpreters over people like women's rights activists. I would generally say that there isn't a single country I could point to that I think has done its fair share at resettling Afghans who are fleeing persecution. And so, yes, that has created a burden on Pakistan. On the other hand, I think that there are ways that the Pakistan government could think about, okay, this is the reality. So how do we deal with it? How do we, ask for support from the rest of the world and put pressure on the rest of the world to sort of keep a pipeline flowing so that people can be resettled while dealing with the immediate needs of people who are arriving in your country every day because they are unsafe, because their daughters can't go to school, because their children are starving to death. So it's a very complicated and difficult situation for Pakistan, and it's a situation where I think the whole world is letting Afghans down. I want to talk really quickly about what our recommendations are at the moment. First of all, we've pushed hard for the Security Council to remove exemptions on the travel bans in place for Taliban leaders. We think that this is a way of sending a clear message to the Taliban about their human rights abuses in a way that does not harm the Afghan people, but that telegraphs international disapproval at these abuses. Second of all, in the Human Rights Council, which is convening again on September 12th, we're pushing for much stronger monitoring of the human rights situation in Afghanistan. Right now, there's a special rapporteur who's a volunteer and has 4 staff members. That's really inadequate for the task at hand, particularly given the ways in which the Afghan media has been silenced, because that, of course, is one of the resources that we relied upon to have information about what was happening around different parts of the country. Third is we're continuing our work on the economic situation, particularly on the issue of allowing the central bank to function again, the Afghan central bank, or if that's not going to be possible, creating some kind of proxy that can fill the role of the central bank, because an economy simply can't function without a functional central bank. And then the last point that we've been making to the international community is about how donors are using their funding. Obviously, we're pushing for sustained humanitarian assistance to Afghanistan, but also pushing donors to think about how their funding can support human rights and human rights activists. One of the things that happened after August 15th is that funding to women's rights organizations and human rights organizations was cut off along with money for everything else. And that should never have happened, and that funding should be restored. Donors should also be looking at how they can fund people who are trying to do important women's rights work and human rights work within the country, even under the very, very difficult circumstances that currently exist, including, people who are running underground schools, for example. It's we can't overstate how devastating the impact is already on the country's future of the fact that there was no new group of women who entered university this year because no one graduated from high school last year. That's your next generation of women in all professions, including professions where the Taliban do think there should be women, such as women healthcare professionals, women educators. There won't be a new generation of those people because that pipeline has been cut off by Taliban abuses. And then the last thing I would just say that we're pushing donors to do is to think broadly about funding and creating alternative education options for these girls who've been shut out of school. My colleagues and I talk frequently with girls and women, and many of the girls we talk to sound suicidal because they're struggling to figure out why to get up, why to continue living when they can't see any future for themselves in this context. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ms. Hyderabad, for your comments. And now, luckily, we have about 10-15 minutes for question answer session. So we can take a few questions. Yes, sir, please.
बिस्मिल्लाहिर्रहमानिर्रहीम। मेरा नाम है रियातुल्लाह खान उर्फ खान बाबू। 2005 से मैं पाकिस्तान अफगानिस्तान पीस पे काम कर रहा हूँ पाक आर्मी के साथ। जनाब, अभी जो करंट सिचुएशन है इस्लामाबाद प्रेस क्लब के सामने, इन लोगों के लिए रमज़ान में पहले मैंने एप्लीकेशन लिखा इंटीरियर मिनिस्ट्री को, फॉरेन, सेफरान, सबको, कुछ भी नहीं हुआ। इवन DC इस्लामाबाद, चीफ कमिश्नर अफगान रेफ्यूजी इस्लामाबाद, कोई भी नहीं हो रहा। फिर हमने प्राइम मिनिस्टर साहब को दरख्वास्त दिए, उन्होंने थोड़ा सा एक्शन ले लिए, लेकिन वो भी एक्शन नहीं है। फिर इसके बाद हमने इन लोगों के साथ बैठ के कैम्प में जरगे बनाया, ग्रुप बनाया। पहले तो ये हुकूमत के साथ बैठते भी नहीं थे क्योंकि सबका कंप्लेंट था, कमिश्नर का कंप्लेंट था, ये लोग बैठते नहीं, हमें बाहर भिजवाए। इसके लिए फिर सैफरान में हम बैठ गए, पूरा 15 दिन एक सेमिनार अरेंज किया। बहुत बड़ा सेमिनार था। इसमें पार्लिमानी सेक्रेटरी आए, उन बेचारों ने अपने करारदाद पास किए। उसको मैंने कन्वेंस किया जरगे लोगों को कि इस वक्त आप लोगों के पास वीज़ा नहीं है। सैफरान बिल्कुल कहते हैं हम इस रिफ्यूजीज को नहीं मानते क्योंकि ये बगैर वीज़े, और हकीकत यही है कि वो सारे बगैर वीज़े। जो वीज़े पे आया था, मैंने खुद इंटीरियर मिनिस्ट्री, पार्लिमानी सेक्रेटरी सबको मैं मिला हूँ। उन्होंने एक लेटर भी जारी किया कि जिसके पास वीज़ा एक्सपायर है उसको फ्री एक्सटेंशन दे दे। लेकिन जो असल मसला है इन लोगों का कि इस्लामाबाद प्रेस क्लब के सामने बैठे, अब सारे वहाँ पे कम्युनिटी तंग आ चुके। कल का आप एक प्रेस रिलीज मेरे पास पड़ा है एक मीडिया पे कि वहाँ पे अब ऐसे सिचुएशन है कि कम्युनिटी अब खुद उठ रही है इन लोगों को निकालने के लिए। तो मेरा यही सजेशन है कि इस सेमिनार के बाद ऐसा कोई इकदाम करे जिसमें जब तक सैफरान, इंटीरियर, फॉरेन ऑफिस इन्वॉल्व नहीं, PM से तरफ से लेटर आज आ गया है, लेकिन बदकिस्मती ये है कि यहाँ पे फ्लड्स आ गए, हर कोई अपने हल्के पे गए, जिससे बात करते हैं वो कहते हैं हल्के में। तो मेरा सजेशन है और गुजारिश है कि यहाँ हालात बहुत ख़राब हो रहे हैं, बहुत, क्योंकि ये लोग जो है किस तरह ज़िंदगी गुजार रहे हैं। और मैंने बहुत कोशिश किया कि इसमें मैंने जरगे बनाए और मैंने रिक्वेस्ट की है कि इस वक्त पाकिस्तान हुकूमत पे बहुत बड़ा मुसीबत आ गए, सैलाब। तो ये है कि मेरा सजेशन है कि एक बहुत बड़ा मसला एक और तरफ जा रहा है, क्योंकि एक तो यही है कि इन लोगों ने जो घर लिया है उसके रेंट वो नहीं दे सकते। सारे मसले हमारे जरगे जा रहे, कभी थाने में कभी किधर, और ये फैसले हल कर रहे हैं। तो मेरा सब जस्ट ये रिक्वेस्ट है कि हालात इस्लामाबाद के बहुत ही ख़राब हो रहे हैं और हुकूमत इस वक्त फ्लड्स है। हम ये नहीं कहते हैं क्योंकि पार्लिमानी सेक्रेटरी भी हमने इन्वॉल्व किया, वो चीफ गेस्ट बने, वो आया, उन्होंने सिफारशनामा भी दे दिया कि ये लोगों की मसाइल है। लेकिन ये है कि मेरा रिक्वेस्ट है कि हालात, मैं खुद भी आज जा रहा था कोहिस्तान, IG इस्लाम KPK ने ऑर्डर किए क्योंकि कोहिस्तान फ्लड्स की वजह से बंद पड़ा है, परसों खोल गया है और वहाँ से आर्मी ने स्पेशल कहा है कि आप लोग आ जाए यहाँ पे। हमने रिलीफ कोई सामान तैयार किए। इस सेमिनार के लिए मैं स्पेशल आज मैंने प्रोग्राम पोस्टपोन किया कि मैं जाऊँ और इस प्लेटफॉर्म पे हम अपना आवाज उठाए कि इन लोगों के लिए कुछ करें, ताकि वहाँ प्रेस क्लब वालों ने जो डीसी और सारे को लेटर्स किए कि यहाँ से उठाए, यहाँ से उठाए, उन लोगों के लिए हमने सब्जी मंडी के साथ कैंप, लेकिन कैंप का सहूलत कौन देगा? जगह है लेकिन सिविल पार्लियामेंट सेक्रेटरी भी पीछे हो गए। बस ये रिक्वेस्ट है कि इस्लामाबाद को बचा लें।
तो बहुत शुक्रिया हिदायतुल्लाह खान साहब आपके कमेंट्स के लिए और आपके ऑब्जर्वेशंस के लिए। इसके चूंकि इसमें कोई जवाब तलब बात नहीं है, तो अगर कोई और सवाल हो मुख्तसर सवाल कीजिए, हमारे पास टाइम कम है जी।
सर मेरा सवाल ये है कि जितने
तारुफ भी करवा दें।
मेरा नाम मोहम्मद उस्मान असद है, मेरा ताल्लुक पाकिस्तान नजरियाती पार्टी के साथ है। मेरा सर सवाल ये है कि जितने भी एजुकेशनल इंस्टीट्यूशन है, चाहे पाकिस्तान के अंदर हो चाहे वेस्ट के अंदर हो, वहाँ पे जो हम लोग मॉरल डिग्रेडेशन देख रहे हैं, लोग जो है ना, जो कपड़ों की जिस तरीके का उनका अंदाज है, जो उनके जिस आइडियाज से उन लोगों को मुतारफ करवाया जा रहा है, मुख्तलिफ किस्म के वेस्टर्न आइडियाज सच एज ट्रांसजेंडरिज्म, फेमिनिज्म एटसेट्रा एटसेट्रा। तो इस तरह की सर डायर सिचुएशन में हम तालिबान से किस तरह एक्सपेक्ट कर रहे हैं कि वो सारी चीज़ों को कंटिन्यू करे फीमेल एजुकेशन को?
साथ ये भी बताया करें कि पैनल में से किससे सवाल करना है, किया आपने?
हसन खान से।
हसन खान साहब से।
आई एम सॉरी, सवाल में पूरा समझा नहीं। सही 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 नहीं, प्रॉब्लम है ये। यस, since the question is about expectations from Taliban, especially on the moral and ethical ground. Definitely, I think this is it's not a matter of morality or ethical things. It's a matter of the people of Afghanistan. It concerns their love. What the international community wants from Afghanistan. I think they don't want Afghanistan to do away with your tribal culture. They don't want Afghanistan to do away with your honors. And as a Pashtun, I'm sometimes using the so-called honor, the word. So they just want to be humane to your own people, and that is to be humane to your own women, to your own kids, to your own children. Because as far as Islam is concerned, you know, Islam doesn't forbid women education. As far as your own Afghan tribal structure is concerned, it doesn't stop your children from going to school. Right at the moment, a lady in Waziristan will be in the schools, a girl will be in Waziristan, in Momand, in Baja, or in Murdan, in Tobatek Singh, anywhere in Pakistan, you see. So women in Pakistan, women in the entire Muslim community, I think nowhere, neither culture, neither Islam. So what the international community is asking Afghan Taliban to do is just to be humane to their own people. I think this is what my understanding is.
This next question. Someone raised hand here. Yes. इसके बाद आपकी तरफ आते हैं.
Hello, my name is Rohul Haddaf and I'm an Afghan student at Qaid Azam University. My question is from Hassan Khan. You said that the international community punish Afghans for the acts of Taliban. I do agree with that, but this is not the Taliban who once fight, attack, and then move to the cave. They are as a government now. So as a government, you have to deal with the international community, respect the international law. So the Taliban, don't you think they are even more harsh on Afghans because they are not willing to compromise, respect the international community? The schools are closed and the women don't have rights to the basic rights. So what is the way forward for the Taliban? Because of their strict strategies, the Afghans suffer. So how the Taliban can stop that the Afghans cannot suffer more?
So I think, sir, this is a very difficult question to say how the Taliban can be forced or can be convinced to deal with your own people or with the international community. Look at the moment, I think majority of Talibans are not like what we say they are. particularly vis-a-vis women education, vis-a-vis dealing with the international community, etc. They want to be engaged because they know, they knew it, that they are no more resisting. They're fighting against any force. At the moment, they have to govern, and they have to govern, and they have to facilitate their people in sectors, services, in provision of services, etc. But unfortunately, the few elites in Afghanistan, as for the recent reports, you might have read those reports, that it is a matter of what we call it ego for them. And it is a matter of their interpretations, which usually we call it the mullah's interpretation of the religion of Islam, like saying that they say that what we see how Islam is, that is the Islam. So is the 4, 5, 6, 7 elders of Taliban. And for them, it is a matter of ego. Afghanistan is a nation of almost, there are Uzbek, Hazara, Pashtun, Ahmad, Tajik, almost 8, 9 ethnicities are there, and are well placed there, and they're living for centuries, etc. So I think this is not a matter of any, what we call it, politics, legal, religious, or tribalist. It's a matter of your ego. If your ego is so, it's not breakable, I think, and you can't be convinced to do something good for your own people. You just say how you believe the Islam is. So you want that Islam to be, I think, spread out, or to be enforced on other. I'm not pretty sure that there will be any big change in the attitude of Taliban in the recent years.
The lady in the last row.
Assalamu alaikum. My name is Isham and I'm a student at Qaid-e-Azam University. I have a question for Mr. Sulman. Sir, are Taliban supporting BLA and TTP? And if yes, then what steps are being taken by the Pakistani government?
I didn't get your question. Can you please repeat?
Sir,
About TTP?
are Taliban supporting TTP and BLA? If yes, then what steps are being taken by the Pakistani government?
Definitely they are supporting TTP. They are giving them the safe havens over there in Afghanistan. This is one of the major bone of contention between Pakistan and Afghanistan right now. The only issue, I would say, rather, that is hindering a lot of development between Afghanistan and Pakistan is this issue of TTP. Nur Ali Masood is been, kept over there. He's now been hidden away a couple of weeks ago under the radar, so that he may not be targeted, because a prominent TTP commanders in the past few months has been targeted over there. This is one of the reasons that Pakistan is, pulling itself back from many other negotiations and many other developments that could have taken with Afghanistan in past 1 year. Pakistan is definitely trying its best to sit on the table to negotiate with the TTP leadership and with the mediation of Afghan Taliban. But we will see in the next couple of months where will it will go, inshallah.
I can see 2, 3 more people raising their hands, but we are getting short of time. The time will end at 11:45. So just half a minute left. I'm so sorry that we can't entertain all those people who wanted to ask questions. So we'll try to conclude right now. I'm thankful to all the panelists who contributed to this rich discussion. And I'm thankful to the participants as well. We discussed so many things about internal dynamics of Afghanistan today. Well, to brief it, to summarize it, I'll say that yes, the Taliban have brought some positive changes as well. They've brought peace, they have reduced corruption, they have reduced crimes in Afghanistan, but at the same time, they have a number of problems as well. There are challenges, they have trust deficit with the rest of the world. They are facing this problem of an inclusive government. They are not working on women's rights and human rights. So all such problems, the other states are not recognizing them. And in fact, the regional countries were very much in support of them. When they were fighting the foreign troops, the region by and large had sympathies with them, not only Pakistan, but Iran, China, Russia, Central Asians. everyone had sympathies with them because number one, they were fighting foreign troops and the presence of foreign troops had undercurrents in the region. And secondly, because all the countries thought that perhaps they are the only force who could fight and beat and defeat Daesh. And the whole region had apprehensions about Daesh. But when they came to government, there were so many broken promises. Initially, they had softened rhetoric, but when they came to government, they couldn't fulfill all their promises. In fact, a few months ago, early this year, when the regional countries were about to make some announcement for their recognition, they announced such measures as asking women not to come to the offices, as putting sort of ban on their education and things like that. So if you allow me to quote a Punjabi line, I'll say that kuch shahar de log bhi paide san, kuch sanu maran da shauq vi si. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much to our chair and all our panelists for joining us today for this really important discussion. We will be continuing for our second session at 12 o'clock. We have a 15-minute tea break. So tea will be served in the hall outside and we can continue the discussion there. Thank you so much. Assalamu alaikum and good afternoon. I would request everyone to please take their seats. We'll be starting shortly. Okay. Yeah, I think it's. Hello. Yes. Assalamu alaikum, and I would like to welcome you all. Assalamu alaikum and good afternoon. I, on behalf of Institute of Regional Studies, would like to welcome you all to our second session of today's conference, which is going to be on Afghanistan challenges and the way forward. The session chair for today is Ambassador Dr. Major General Raza Mohammed, who is the president of IPRI. We are very honored to have him here as our chair today. We also have Ms. Amna Khan, who is the director of CAMIA at ISSI. Mr. Ubaidullah Bahir, who is a lecturer of transitional justice at the American University in Afghanistan. We will also have Dr. Salma Malik joining us, who is assistant professor, Qaid-e-Azam University, and Maulvi Sardar Ahmed Shakib, who is the minister counselor, Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan. Sir, and I would like to hand you over the floor.
I'm very grateful to Ambassador Nadeem Riaz for giving me this honor to come here and talk to you people and chair this session. I think it's a very, very important topic which IRS has taken up for discussion. Today is the second day and we are into the second session of the second day. It's a matter, it's a problem which actually occupies minds of all the thinking people in Pakistan. And not only people, everyone who is there on the streets even. More importantly, what I think is that what are the questions which need to be answered today? First question is, the first problem which I foresee has been dealing with Afghanistan. Please, ma'am, come over. Thank you so much. So I think, although most of the things have been discussed in the past sessions also, the answers we need to find is the most important for me is, why is Pakistan such a hated country in Afghanistan? Despite 40 years of sacrifices, being with them, having sacrificed so much, having suffered so much in both the Afghan wars, I would say, The first one after the Soviet occupation and the second after the 9/11. 20 years after 9/11, or more than 20 years now, and 10 years of 79 to 89. You opened your borders, you opened your homes, you opened your hearts and souls to welcome Afghan brethren. And they're still around. I think there are close to now 3 million people, registered 2 million, now 400,000 they were saying have come now. And I haven't seen any agitation in Pakistan कि कोई भी बाजारों में खड़ा हो, रोडों पे खड़ा हो, अफगानों के खिलाफ खड़ा हो कि ये क्यों है, इनको निकाल दो. You've been so welcoming. फिर बाकी जो चीजें हैं, I don't need to repeat, you all know it. It is a very well aware audience. तो क्यों फिर हमें क्यों? Why are we hated so much? Yesterday's match is another manifestation of this thing. This used to happen between Pakistan and India when we had the matches with India, and we would see these kinds of scenes there. But alhamdulillah, dono countries mature ho gayi. So is it that? Your next question is how to help them stand on their feet. A recognition of Afghanistan is a major issue. Within that, the humanitarian issues, and within the humanitarian issues, जो सबसे बड़ी concern की चीज़ हमारे लिए है, being neighbors, being Islamic country, and alhamdulillah, progressive Islamic country, is the women rights. Inclusivity की बातें हम बहुत करते रहे, but women inclusion और education के rights उनको देना, jobs के rights देना बहुत ज़रूरी है. अभी आप जब दीन की बात करते हैं, when we talk of Islam and women, you start off with the example of Hazrat Khadija Raziyallahu Ta'ala anha. She was the first entrepreneur of the Islam. She was 15 years elder to Prophet Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam when they were married. And it was perhaps third marriage of Hazrat Khadija. You go to the wars, the Ghazwat, Pali wars, you see the women. Hazrat Salma, she was the first one who killed an infidel. Pali was soldier, you can call her. She was there. And so many other things. They were nursing the wounds. They were taking care of the logistics of the men when they were in the war. And most importantly, when Rasulullah was praying in Jabal al-Nur Ghar Hira, तो उनको सारा जो logistics था वो खदीजा देखती थी. तो वहाँ पे तो कोई पाबंदियां नहीं थी ऐसी, ना पढ़ाई पे थी. और रसूल की जो हदीस है उसके बारे में एम्बेसडर ब्रार ने ऑलरेडी बात की. Last but not the least है कि जो हम inclusivity की बात करते हैं within Afghanistan, and also I would say integrating with the international community. तो ये कुछ चीज़ें ऐसी हैं जो हमें by end of the day, by end of the seminar, the answers we need to find. And recognition में है कि how to go about it. Is it going to be one country, two countries, a regional arrangement, or in my opinion, perhaps regional? वो मैं पहले नहीं कहूँगा. So coming over to the speakers of today, first sub-theme will be taken over by Ms. Amna Khan. She is, अच्छा इधर Amna Khan. जी. So यहाँ पे Amna Khan है. जी. So you have edited book on Afghanistan. I was telling you, I just read that book. It's a very good work. Dr. Salma Malik जो हैं, she is well known. She is well known scholar. She speaks on many things. She works on international relations, women, economic issues, and social issues, and all that. We have with us Mr. Ubaidullah Bahir. Ubaidullah Bahir. He is lecturer of transitional justice at the American University in Afghanistan. He is very well known academician. So अगर मुझे नाम लेने में या किसी चीज़ में कोई गलती होगी तो माफ कीजिएगा because I went through this. So who is going to be the first speaker now?
If I request, since Dr. Salma has been my teacher and I could
Achha,
never
that is
speak
why you
before
changed the
her,
precedence.
that is why I did. So I would rather,
That's
concede
a
and
good
give
thing
her
to
the
do.
floor. Yes.
That's a good thing to do. I think I, being a student, also would actually give precedence to my teacher. See, please, Ms. Malik.
Thank you, Dr. Saab, General Saab, whatever you may call you, both are appropriate. And thank you so much, Amna, for taking revenge of the centuries from me right here and now. Now people know whatever I did to you guys when I was a teacher and you were a student. So should I focus on my topic, or are we also shifting the topics? No, we are looking at the future prospects for Afghanistan and the region.
Second panelists were here, then the theme could have been discussed much more.
Okay. So why don't you people, if you want to take the lead, you do that, or is is Maulvi Sardar Saab coming? He is on his way. Please, thank you so much. I'll be truly grateful. Thank you.
All right. Thank you so much, first of all, to the IRS for giving me the opportunity. It's the first time that I'm speaking here. I'm sure it's going to be repetitive because obviously this, the topic has been more or less the same. I've just jotted down a couple of points, and mine's going to be pretty general, but I hope to cover the challenges that do exist and hopefully the way forward, something that we've been hearing over the past 2 decades, and unfortunately not a lot has changed apart from the people that are in power now. Now, as you're all aware, circumstances in Afghanistan have changed, and they continue to drastically change since the Taliban came into power. Now, while initially there were questions as to what the Taliban's rule will mean for governance, for human women's rights, for counterterrorism assurances, or even for regional peace and stability, I think the past year has somewhat set the tone in motion, and it's an indication of how the group is going to govern the country. Now, even a year on, and within the confines of this so-called interim setup that we keep on hearing about, I think the real test for the Taliban is by no means limited to just securing power. It revolves around legitimacy, which is a very important question, acceptance, performance, and lastly, and more importantly, what the Taliban are seeking, recognition. Now, we've seen that domestically, the group's performance is debatable, depending on where it comes from. One has seen an overall improvement in the security of the country, with the exception of the presence of the ISKP. However, then another question comes in, where is human security? And that's a big question mark, and they haven't been able to deliver on that. And I think that aspect remains a bit ambivalent. Now, the group is trying to consolidate its power, whether it's within the group or within the country, because there are issues within rank and file. Now, governance, again, continues to be a major stumbling block because, let's be honest here, the dispensation does not have the capacity nor the expertise or the manpower, for that matter, to run the ministries. Because let's just face it, a majority of the educated class has been, the brain drain has taken place in Afghanistan. So there are issues when it comes to governance. While the group time and again has been giving assurances that they will work towards an interim setup, a more inclusive setup, and we have seen the inclusion of 1 or 2 members from other ethnic factions. To be very fair, it's not a representative political setup, but I think the term inclusivity and representative is somewhat relative, and I think it depends on the particular country that you're focusing on. But the fact that they say it is interim is somewhat reassuring, and it shows that there is room for expansion. Now, the group, as I said, is struggling to formulate policies towards Afghan institutions, be it the bureaucracy, security. And let us not forget, the government has inherited extremely weak institutions, a non-existent economy, not to mention the humanitarian crisis, and on top of that, the natural calamities that the region is facing, and Afghanistan is no exception. Now, financial sanctions on the Taliban have paralyzed the banking system, and therefore it has affected the overall economy of the country. Now, while the provision of humanitarian aid by certain countries, including Pakistan and more so by US, who's given around 775 million, is certainly, I think, reassuring, it is not enough to stabilize the economy, let alone the Afghan population. And do remember, 95% of them are food insecure. So in such circumstances, I think it is important for the international community to move away from politics and revisit this entire concept of engagement and ultimate recognition. Because look, at the end of the day, the Taliban, since they came into power, have been engaging with regional countries directly, and they have been engaging with the international community through Doha. And that, in my limited mind, is de facto recognition, if not de jure. Now, everything is not as bleak as it seems. The economy is one area where the Taliban have delivered, even with the limited expertise that they have. And I'll just give you a quote from from September to December 2021, they were able to collect around 400 million through revenues, taxes, as well as the export of natural resources like coal. Moreover, let us not forget that corruption has been clamped down on, and there is security. But then there are other important areas that the Taliban can very easily deliver on, and unfortunately they have not. And that it pertains to those basic pledges of reform and very basic yet fundamental rights that are so necessary for human survival. And that, of course, entails human women's rights, education for all. It is very unfortunate that the Taliban backtracked on their decision to allow women to go to school. I think this is a major stumbling block, and the Taliban do not seem to realize that it is isolating them from the international community, and I think also from regional countries, because if they do not deliver on these basic yet very simple, elements pertaining to human security or human values, it'll be very difficult for regional countries, including Pakistan, to engage with the Taliban. Now, even we have seen, and I think this warrants a little recognition for the Taliban, that while you do not have complete rights, but the fact that people can come out onto the streets and they can protest is something that warrants recognition on the part of the Taliban. The fact that you do have, even if it's limited, women representation on Tolo News, for example, or media outlets, but it's not good enough. It's certainly, the bar has to be raised, but I think this is something that does need some recognition. Now, we keep on talking about the threats in Afghanistan. They're certainly domestic, and of course they pertain to the economy, humanitarian crisis. But in my opinion, I think by and far, the largest or the biggest threat to Afghanistan, and that then permeates to the region, is the presence of transnational terrorist groups in Afghanistan, primarily the ISKP. Now, if you see, since August, when the Taliban came into power, there has been a spike in terrorist activities by the ISKP. And this has not just been limited to the internal dynamics of Afghanistan. The ISKP has been working with a number of other transnational terrorist groups, including the TTP, including the ETIM/TIP, IMU. There are numerous terrorist groups that are operating. And I think the fear in my mind is that if the Taliban are not able to consolidate their position and are not able to create some semblance of stability, it is these terrorist groups that will take advantage, and they are taking advantage. There is growing frustration within the region, particularly after the Zawahiri attack and the fact that Pakistan, for example, has been, suffering immensely because of these cross-border attacks. There is a growing frustration amongst Afghanistan's immediate neighbors that if the Taliban cannot deliver on their pledges of reform, which pertain to counterterrorism, assurances, then these are big question marks. And I don't think that, the region has the patience. Do remember that for the past 2 decades, the region has been a direct consequences of what has been happening in Afghanistan, and particularly Pakistan. And I just want to come over to what General Saab said regarding the relationship. It is unfortunate, but I think for the past 2 decades and even longer, but I'll limit it to the past 2 decades, the relationship has always been viewed through a very narrow prism, and that is security. I do remember whenever the relationship improved, it was only because you had positive developments in the peace process, and then you would hear comments from Kabul of Pakistan and Afghanistan being conjoined twins. And the minute something went, wrong in the peace process, then you would, be indulged in that vicious blame game that really didn't get both countries anywhere. So as a result, I think important contours of any bilateral relationship have largely suffered. And therefore you see the fact that even though at one point we have hosted more than 5 million Afghan refugees, unfortunately, even today in 2022, we are still talking about people-to-people contacts and how we can improve that. This is a question that has bewildered me time and again, and maybe Obaidullah can touch upon this. And I think not just yesterday, but previous matches are a reflection, unfortunately, of the deep mistrust that continues to exist between these two countries. And I find it extremely strange that even though we are so interdependent, we still do not have a strategic bilateral framework. The Afghans have signed a strategic partnership agreement with India, with Iran, and there is nothing with Pakistan. We did try to move towards APAPs, but again, that was again a victim of the vicious blame game that has continued to fester this relationship. Now, Again, I will say that it is very, very important to remain engaged despite the challenges. The challenges will always remain there. And I think the bilateral irritants between Pakistan and Afghanistan are not just limited to the Taliban. If anybody thought in their right mind that the Taliban will come into power and the relationship will improve, I think it was highly naive of them to think so, because the bilateral irritants between these two countries have been there since times immemorial. And unfortunately, I don't think any robust measures have been taken to address them. And that is why I feel it is essential that these two countries do engage with one another. And in my opinion, I think they should, under the table, try to focus on a strategic bilateral agreement pending formal recognition. Now, quickly, Pakistan's approach towards Afghanistan, I think, is very clear. Unlike the past, we're following a regional approach. We have not recognized the Taliban, and our expectations of the Taliban are exactly the same as the expectations the international community have. And I don't think we've given them any leeway in this. But I think by and far, unless and until the Taliban do not deliver on counterterrorism assurances, I think this is going to be a major, major issue, and it's going to keep these countries at bay. This is something that the Taliban need to focus on. Moreover, on the international community's part, I think it is very disingenuous of them to give precedence to one conflict over the other. And of course, I'm referring to the Ukraine crisis. Afghanistan has always had global ramifications, and I think it's very important for the international community to remain engaged. I understand that Ukraine is on their side of the border, but I think this crisis has made them realize what Pakistan and therefore Iran and other countries have been going through for more than 2 decades. And therefore, Afghanistan needs to be viewed as a collective or a shared responsibility. I think it's disingenuous of the international community to push, the responsibility of Afghanistan on regional countries. Certainly, regional countries need to take ownership, but they have far too many problems of their own. And therefore, we need to view Afghanistan as a collective and shared responsibility. Moreover, I will just end here by saying that I think we need to keep in mind that the Taliban did not come into power through isolation. They came in through a process, and that process was the agreement, the Doha Agreement. We might agree or disagree on how good or bad the agreement was. Certainly, it had its flaws. And I think the biggest flaw was keeping Kabul out. But the Taliban are in power now, and the international community is engaging with them as the de facto authorities. Therefore, I think the only way to hold the Taliban responsible, to make them deliver, is to remain engaged and continue to push for those assurances that the Taliban agreed to in the Doha Agreement. More so, again, I will repeat, mistakes of the past should not be repeated, and they are being repeated. And I think Ukraine is a glaring example of that. I will end here. Okay, thank you.
I will have to see the sequence. And now we move to Mr. Obed. Yes.
Thank you, Your Excellency. Thank you, Amna Khan, for your remarks as well. As much as I'd enjoy discussing cricket here and what happened yesterday, I think maybe in another time, in a better place. But also, I think we all should be mindful of never becoming that person who recounts the good that they've done whenever something bad happens. Also, there's a problem with the statement when a few individuals do a few things and your response is, we have done this to them, right? So we shouldn't generalize. I think that just creates further issues and tensions. I think there's a lot of introspection required on both sides. There's a lot of work required on both sides. How I want to structure my talk today is I want to start off with how any international engagement with the Taliban is very highly contingent on how the Taliban are seen, right? In international politics, one of the things that is fundamental with regards to engagement is the reputation cost that any engagement incurs, which is why the world came up with track 2 and track 1.5 diplomacies, because it's sometimes very difficult to sit down with someone when they're viewed by your own voters as people that can be evil. Then I'll hopefully touch upon a few regional players that we can talk about, think about global players. And lastly, I was upstairs and I saw the book, The Politics of Small Things by Arundhati Roy. And I think that book is very often read as a novel, not as a political commentary, and that is our fault. There are ideas within that book that could help make this world a better place, and especially Afghanistan in its current times. So how should the Taliban be viewed? Sun Tzu, in his book, The Art of War, and I know it sounds like I'm quoting Machiavelli and I'm going a few thousand years back in history, but it's important to hear this quote out. He says that if a man carries his sword, if he brandishes his sword and walks into the marketplace, he challenges anyone and everyone he sees to a fight till death. If no one faces him, I will not call that man brave, nor will I call the people cowards, for he is a desperado and they are not, right? And very often when we look at the Taliban or any group that we don't want to engage with, we start viewing them as absolute evils, as absolute terrorists, absolute evils in groups such as the Nazis, who any form of association with or negotiation with would make you, by that association, a bad person or a bad entity. An absolute terrorist in the sense of this desperado, when you hold that trigger for your suicide vest, there is no turning back, right? And that's how we view absolute terrorists, as suicide bombers, as people that cannot be negotiated with, which is a faulty approach, because at the end of the day, terrorism at the core of it is a political act. It's a means to a political end. And those who are in command and directing these suicide bombers have political aspirations, and you can always discuss them with them rationally. So I think that, for starters, is important to see the Taliban in a way that they are a result of their contexts. They are Afghans at the end of the day, and there are people that can be talked to and hopefully to change. There is very often this conversation in the West about the popularity of the Taliban, whether they're representative of the Afghans or whether the Afghans supported them to come into power. And I think that's sometimes linked and tied up to the sanctions that were imposed on Afghanistan, because it justifies the collective punishment of the Afghans. However, that being said, the Afghans were very indifferent towards the Taliban. They were okay with the republic being overthrown. And that in itself is one step that they were ahead. They were winning the contested space, urban space, something that Kilcullen talks about with regards to urban warfare zones. But the Taliban need to move ahead, and they need to start thinking about internal legitimacy, because unless they have that, no international player is going to discuss things with them as a legitimate representative of Afghanistan, maybe in de facto terms, but not really in de jure. Keeping all of that in mind, the limitations that we just discussed, I think we could move forward to looking at the United States and its Western allies and their engagement with Afghanistan. 3 points I want to raise here. One, Tom West, who's the current special envoy to Afghanistan, he used to work for Zalmay Khalilzad, right? And imagine the hierarchy of an organization where the second in command becomes in charge, right? So you could think that that man is being promoted, but really that department is being demoted and becoming smaller. And that's what Biden's approach towards Afghanistan was. He was always the person, he was the same president, he was a senator back then, who voted against an operation of extracting allies from Saigon. And that mindset stayed. So there are quotations about him hating the word Afghanistan coming up in conversations, right? So the issue of Afghanistan is shrinking under his administration. Second thing that Afghans and thinkers about Afghanistan and commentators should be very mindful of is to not make Afghanistan a polarized issue within the United States. And that's something groups like the National Resistance Front are trying to do in the United States, where they're reaching out to Republicans to get their support. That would mean that every regime change within the United States is going to have a drastic shift in policies towards Afghanistan, and Afghanistan really cannot afford that at this time. And at the end of the day, the reputation cost that it incurs of engaging with the Taliban costs votes. And if you look at the timing of the Zawahiri bombing, if you look at the timing of the bin Laden assassination, it's always political. The United States knew where the Zawahiri was for 6 months. So the comments that you heard in the panel before that the Federal Reserves were going to be issued, but suddenly the Zawahiri thing happened, doesn't hold any truth. So they had intelligence reports. It was always planned to happen this way. And Biden's administration does this now to show that he's taking a tough stance on Afghanistan. And he's not going to change that anytime soon. November is when the midterm elections are going to happen. So they're mindful of their voters and how they're going to act. The second important players with regards to Afghanistan is Pakistan and India. I was actually going to tweet something really funny. If the final of the Asia Cup was going to be between Pakistan and India, I was going to say that for the first time, a Pakistan versus India event is happening in somewhere other than Afghanistan. But unfortunately, I think India's out, so you guys are going to be in the final all alone. But there's a problem, right? There's the problem of always seeing Afghanistan as this contested field between Pakistan and India. And that has really hurt all of us, right? Because here's the scorpion and the frog analogy, right? So the frog is standing at the edge of the river. The scorpion comes up to him and says, "Can you help me cross?" And the frog is like, "Well, I don't really trust you because you're going to be on my back and I will not be able to stop you from stinging me." And he's like, "I'm not stupid. We're going to both drown if I sting you in the middle of the water." And he's like, "Fair enough." So the scorpion hops on and the frog is in the middle of the water and the scorpion stings him. And he's like, "What? We're going to both drown now." And he's like, "I can't help it. It's in my nature," right? And that's the problem. The problem of Pakistan and India viewing each other as that scorpion and frog analogy means that there's a constant obsession that the field in Afghanistan is going to be used against one or the other. And Afghanistan has only truly thrived when it has been non-aligned, when it hasn't been dragged into great games. At the peak of our economy was during the Second World War because we refused to align with any greater power. So the great games have always hurt us. Pakistan truly has an influence on the Taliban. Unfortunately, that influence is oftentimes overestimated in scope because the Pakistani contact with the Taliban is through a very specific group. And unless that group has greater influence, it's not going to work. There's also memories of abductions and being handed over to the CIA that still exist with a lot of the Kandahari Taliban. So their reliance is ever more heavier on Iran. Now, here's the difference. Now moving to Iran, and I've just one more hopefully, then we'll start wrapping up. I want you to compare Pakistan's influence to Iran's influence on the Taliban. Pakistan didn't want the Panjshir fight to happen, right? So there were, the Masood entity was in Panjshir. Pakistan had a few members of the Haqqani family travel in and out of Pakistan a few times to lead negotiation and make sure that the fighting didn't happen. They couldn't. The fight eventually happened. Iran, on the other hand, after Panjshir has been defeated, after NRF basically doesn't even exist on the ground, gets Muttaqi, the foreign minister of Afghanistan, to travel to Iran to sit with Masood and offer him a ministry in the cabinet, a ministry in a cabinet that has no other Taliban, right? This is just to show you the amount of influence that exists on the Kandahari belt that is in power, right? So you have to be very mindful of that and try to understand exactly how that dynamic works. You have the Tajikistan and the Russian belt as well. Tajikistan is trying to support the resistance, but anyone who knows anything about insurgencies will tell you that unless you offer safe havens, physical safe havens, insurgencies cannot thrive, something that Tajikistan is not going to give any resistance group or any Afghan group because of the proximity to Russia. And China generally is in it for the money. They've done that in Africa. One of the biggest problems is that they go to the most atrocious regimes and they say, "I'm not going to ask any questions as long as we can do business." And they're going to do that in Afghanistan as well. There is the Qatar and the UAE competition as well. And let's hope that doesn't turn Afghanistan into another Syria, because we already saw the Saudi and UAE influence there. But just to sum up, I know we constantly keep listing problems. Everyone who's going to come up here is going to tell you that there are a lot of issues. But the reason I mentioned Arundhati Roy is the God of small things is an acute and untouchable in that book. And he decides, since he can't change the larger culture of how he is seen, he decides to fall in love with a woman that is beyond his caste. He decides to create a group of individuals that are outcasts. And through their engagement and dialogue, they build their own society. That's how we break out of the grander narratives. Every interaction we have with the Taliban is them changing, is us changing. And if we decide to let go of the guns for once and keep having those interactions, the saner voices, the more just voices are always going to win. Ask Martin Luther King, ask Nelson Mandela, ask Gandhi, and you will have your answers. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Mr. Bahi. I think last line was very moving, very impressionable. Justice, sanity, truth will win. The next speaker which we have now is Dr. Salma Malik on the future prospects of Afghanistan and the region. Ma'am.
Thank you very much. I wish we didn't have the cricket match last night. It seems to be dominating the conversation here. But when we're looking at the future prospects for Afghanistan and the region, and I must compliment Amna and Mr. Bahir both for their excellent perspective. Amna makes the task very easy by giving a very rounded scenario of what is happening within Afghanistan. But when we look at the region per se, unfortunately, the region of South Asia, and if you're looking at the region from the South Asian perspective, because it entirely depends on where you're standing in the region and trying to define a regional setup. But I would take a very traditional take on this, and I'm looking at South Asia, the 7 countries of South Asia plus Afghanistan, that makes 8 countries, which are a collectivity of states at the best than otherwise. There is genuinely no commitment within the region. It has never been the case, which is a very, very unfortunate scenario. It was, I think, the hallmark or the high mark of the region per se was in the 1980s and the 1990s, when the founding fathers of SAARC actually invested their soul and spirit into this this collectivity or this vision that they call the South Asian Association for Regional Cooperation, and they tried to make it look into something good. The very fact that the SAARC was made to not discuss traditional issues, but non-traditional issues. And I wish the countries of the region would have realized it. And it was supposed to be one country, one vote, no bilateralism, entirely regional tendencies, non-traditional issues would take precedence, etc. But over the years, the way the South Asian region by itself is formed, that totally killed the spirit of SAARC. For many of us, when we are looking at SAARC as a region, we say the SAARC was a non-starter. Why was it a non-starter? Because from the very beginning, the countries who envisioned SAARC were not India or Pakistan. They were smaller countries of the region. And any initiative that was coming from those countries was not entirely welcomed. A bit debatable issue, but something that did work so far. Something that does exist in Nepal, known as the SAARC Secretariat, exists there. Many of our colleagues from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs would be very well versed about it, that the SAARC Secretariat celebrates more holidays, the national days of the 7 + 8, 8 countries of South Asia, more than any other regional association would ever do. But at least there is something where the 8 flags are flying together, even if they are not entwined with one another, but there is a collectivity there. So the very premise that there is very little regional integration and what Barry Bizan and Oliver Weaver would call, when they're looking at the regional security complex, as patterns of enmity tend to override those of amity. And this is a hypothesis that if we go by this particular notion, to a certain extent that is true. Unfortunately, where India, Pakistan, India, China, or other countries of the region, India, Bangladesh as well, They find areas to fulfill their limited scale problems in different areas in terms of Pakistan and India. The line of control has been most active in this regard. Afghanistan has remained a major proxy ground for both these big powers of the region to play out their interest. There was once a lot of noise about having an X number of consulates in Afghanistan by India, which were working against Pakistan. And I would always laugh at that notion because they don't need to set up formal consulates to do work against us. They can operate, and they have been operating very well by representing themselves through the humanitarian or international non-governmental organizations. A lot can happen, is happening, especially when it comes to the US-India strategic partnership. So there's a lot of sharing of intelligence and several things that are happening. And this is an unfortunate situation for a country like Afghanistan, which saw for a brief 20 years time period, a dream that everyone wants to live, where people are free to do as and how they please. But this also came with a very, very heavy cost. People had to work very hard. And one would feel at the end of Ghani government, before the Taliban had come in, as to how many of our young Afghan friends working in Afghanistan, doing several great work, would feel this despondency that what if this is happening? There is no grassroots investment that the institutions that have been put in through this enterprise, the democratic enterprise, they are not so deep-rooted that they can withstand any big attack. And this actually proved, I mean, there was no attack, so to speak. The Americans actually asked the Taliban to come and take over Kabul to avoid any type of major civil unrest. And that was the end of everything. That totally stopped the entire democratic process. But then there is a major question to the fact that was there really a democracy towards the end of Ghani regime? And that is something that's a topic for another discussion and not actually part of my purview. But when we go further, then we also see that not only the INGOs or the humanitarian institutions were used to collect data or to collect intelligence against one another, there's also support to the Afghan local proxies that they would do whatever they wanted to do. And this is not by just one country, several countries were doing that. Furthermore, if we look at the region, if we go away from this very uncomfortable security profiling, but we look at the major draw factor, and that is the economic factor. When you look at the CPEC or the BRI estimates, the fact that China brought in investment to all of these countries, but prior to doing that, if we look at the intra-regional trade of South Asia, the 8 countries of South Asia, it's only 5% of the total potential, which is so low, despite the fact that this is one region that accommodates 1/4 of the global population, which is not exactly living in a very, very happy circumstances. There's a major divide of the haves and the have-nots, and which is increasing by the time. Plus the fact that there was a time when South Asia, by and large, was a poor region. Now you have inequality within South Asia. And that is also going to widen with time. So how do we bridge this gap? That is happening. So across South Asia, you don't find a common economic profile. You find a very zigzag or a different ECG, economic ECG that is not really working very well. If we don't want to flatline, absolutely, but we want a stable ECG when it comes to socioeconomic development, when it comes to economic uplift. And unfortunately, that is not happening at an even pace within South Asia. So that is another factor. Afghanistan remains problematic, which is a thing everyone has decided upon. There's a consensus that yes, this area will remain problematic and we have to accept it the way it is. And this is the biggest problem in the picture, that if you accept this anomaly and you don't want to correct the anomaly, this is not going to work. But do we have those synergies at the regional level? That is a major question, because any of the regional countries who want to pitch into Afghanistan are doing it at the behest of another country. If India, which has a seasonably big purse, invest in Afghanistan, They are doing it not so much for the love of Afghanistan, rather to counter Pakistan. If Pakistan is doing it, that is for also two reasons. Number one, they want to have a stable and secure Afghanistan so that its troubles don't spill over into the country, which is kind of next to impossible, but also for the fact that they also want to contain India going beyond a certain point. But this is an idealistic notion when I say for the love of the other country, because there is no love lost when we are looking at Clausewitz and the Machiavellis of the world, because every country is fending for its own interest. If we look at Afghanistan, from the Pakistan side, we find a very different set of actors who are also playing us against the other countries. When the Afghans look at us, the picture totally changes. And this is how the countries build their perspective. If we feel emotional about it, then we are wrong, because emotions don't override the world. But how do we actually go work around these realities is the basic art of diplomacy. It's the basic art of the real politics, how best we are trying to play with the options that are available to us. Okay, so it's also a region which has one of the largest youth bulges of the future. So if we are looking at the future of Afghanistan, what are we actually providing to, we are looking at the future of South Asia, what are we actually providing or investing in? We are actually investing very well in furthering these patterns of enmity. We are furthering the patterns of discontent. We are further investing in patterns which are going to drive South Asians away from each other. I think ours is the last generation until such time that Modi or other such ultra-nationalist actors are gone from the scenario. And that does not mean that there's only one Modi. There can be Modis anywhere and everywhere. The ultra-nationalists, the hardliners who do not want to connect people with one another at the regional grid, but they are the people who want to create nationalistic divides, fault lines, so that people do not interact. And this fault line between Pakistan and India is actually creating so much of fissures in Bangladesh as well. And the bridge building definitely needs to be done. The more time we lose on this is the time where people stop relating to each other. On a personal anecdote, I remember a long time back, when I say that I'm one of those last generations, or some of the people much younger to us sitting here who have had this possibility to interact with the Indians going to India while being there, or the Indians coming to Pakistan. Most of the time now we are meeting at neutral grounds because the visa issue is so difficult. That I came across this young Bengali scholar who came to me and she said, "Oh, when you're in Pakistan, you wear the burqa." And I said, "When I'm in Pakistan, I don't wear the burqa." So he said, "Then how do you go around?" So I said, "I go around the way I'm going around here on my 2 feet, wearing whatever I'm wearing." But I was expecting such a question coming from an Indian. I'm also stereotyped. I wasn't expecting such a question coming from a Bengali citizen who is a fellow Muslim, whom I thought had similar viewpoints as I had. But the very fact is that we don't meet each other. We don't interact with each other. There are so much of stereotypical thinking that we carry against each other that it is very difficult to figure that there is a commonality of future as well. So we really need to, as a region, invest in those constituencies of peace if we want the region to really work. So if the sole regional body, SARC, needs to be looked at, which has actually very effectively been rendered ineffective, one of the questions that India keeps on bringing up is that should the region actually have a new body? Now that the SARC is defunct, it is on a ventilator. Shall we actually bury SARC and come up with another regional body? India is already working on several notions. There's the BIMSTEC. There is always also SARC -1, that is Pakistan formula. Unfortunately, Pakistan can't be get rid of and then access Afghanistan. So they look at SARC -1. But unfortunately, the fault does not lie with the regional body. The fault lies with with the region by itself. The DNA of the region is faulty. Where, as I just said, that we don't want to cooperate, we don't want the region to work as a collectivity. The pandemics that happened, they could be something that could be a bridging ground. And the pandemics, floods, natural disasters, earthquakes, Afghanistan is quite prone to those earthquakes. One happened recently as well. These are golden opportunities where SARC can actually be revived on the non-traditional grounds, and one can talk about it. At the height of the pandemic, 2 years back, there were 2 SARC virtual summits that took place. Whatever happened to them, everyone is familiar with that. There was also a big hue and cry about the economic pledges that were being made to counter the pandemic. But did something really happen? Again, the COVAX diplomacy within the region was also being used to win favors. So it wasn't anything that was being done on the idealistic humanitarian grounds. So long as we keep on playing and we keep on sort of putting into gray the traditional and the non-traditional scenario, and my apologies for sounding so pessimistic here, but that is what the reality and the near future appears to be. Things will continue the way it is. Now, interestingly, if we audit this 1 year progress of the region vis-a-vis Afghanistan, for Pakistan from day one, I would say we had more or less a similar strategy. Even prior to the Taliban regime taking over, Pakistan was trying to negotiate or trying to talk to or bring to the table as many regional Afghan actors as possible as to what would happen. But then as a result of Doha, as a result of President Ghani's earlier exit from Afghanistan, the Taliban were asked to take over and that happened. But in the around that time, there was a lot of conversation happening in India about what will happen to the females. The females will be put in the burqa, the females will be killed, all the seculars, people were really scared. They were recalling the time of the earlier Taliban regime, and all of that panic and everything was created. My argument at that time was also that let's hope that Afghanistan survives for another day, another week, another month, and these things can be looked at much later. Indians who were raising a lot of hue and cry about women emancipation, women participation, what would happen to the women, inclusivity of the government, are the same actors who are now back in Afghanistan without normalizing relations with Afghanistan, but this informal normalization of relations by all the actors within the region and outside is something that is also providing the Taliban regime with zero incentive to do better. Because when we look at, and as Abdullah was also mentioning about democracy and tyrannical regimes, unfortunately, the real politics and the interest of the countries, even the US, has nothing to do with promotion of democracy. They are just fulfilling their agenda and they're just fulfilling their interests. Afghanistan today stands at a very unfortunate situation. The US, after making this bad war in Afghanistan, took a good 20 years to exit this troubled land, got a semblance of assurance and the fact that it was an honorable exit in whatever terms that we may call it. But the fact is that the US is not returning to Afghanistan anytime sooner. Their focus is now diverted towards Ukraine, towards Europe, and towards South China Sea. So why should they return to Afghanistan? Why should they again burn their already burnt wings? Yes, the 2 killings that have happened are not done so much to help the Afghans. They are done actually for a very, very weak, all the time stumbling Biden government to show that they have teeth. They are for domestic consumption. They're not for the love of the Afghan nationals. They already have this deal with the Taliban that they will hold Afghanistan baseline stable and secure. And the Taliban are doing that. Yes, they are not the perfect actors. They also have their antichrist working against them. So long as it does not really tip the balance, Americans are fine with that. Let's talk about the other extra-regional actors. China, Russia, all of them, even India, they have their interests there. They never closed their embassies. They even kept their diplomatic staff working there. And the Indians are back there. None of them are formalizing relation, but they are maintaining their relations at the informal level. Where goes women inclusivity? Where goes the rights for the youth, for the young girls, for the girls to go? Right, sir. I'm just finishing. So the bad news that I had with this presentation was that we really need to understand that for the region and for the international community, there are two Afghanistans. One Afghanistan, which is now stable and secure. The regime is not something that would ideally they would have liked to be there, but at least they're not creating troubles till such time that, God forbid, there's another semblance of a 9/11. If that happens, then the extra-regional powers will think what to do. Within the region, if we really want Afghanistan and the region to work, then we, in an ideal world, in an alternate universe, we have to get together, we have to revive or bring up another regional body that looks at problems from a very neutral and ideal territory. There are genuine problems. If you do not provide 50% of Afghan population, that are the women, the chance to educate or go out and earn for themselves, Afghanistan is going to halt in the future. Afghanistan is going to regress. And in a world which is interconnected and interdependent, a failing Afghanistan is going to create a failing South Asia. And as I said, the South Asian ECG is not all that great to talk about. So we really don't want to get into a situation which is going to create further trouble. And Afghanistan is not the only problem. It's also the regional approach towards traditional, non-traditional problems of the region that we really need to address and look at. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Ladies and gentlemen, you heard three eminent scholars and speakers. First was the emerging global and regional scenario, in which we heard Mr. Bahir and Ms. Amna Khan. And then in second, the future prospect for Afghanistan and the region. Dr. Salma Malik delved on it very effectively and in detail. Unfortunately, we could not have Maulvi Sardar Ahmad Shakib, who is charged the affair and Minister Councilor of Islamic Emirate of Pakistan. It would have been actually very good, and we would have been lucky to have him to hear firsthand from him. Now we straight move into the question and answer session. You know the protocol. Please identify yourself, ask question. I think we do not have time for comments. So just a moment. One-liner question, and also identify the speaker whom you would like to answer. So we'll take 3 questions at one time. First, Mr. Jamal, Ambassador Jamal.
Sir, I take the liberty of a little comment because there are 3 panelists. Mr. Barir, I agreed with you completely that there is a need for reflection, introspection, and compassion. And we should avoid getting swayed away by emotions. You refer to the cricket match. And the other thing that you said, the story of the scorpion and the frog, I'm still acrobating in my mind as to who is the scorpion and who is the frog in the story. But you would know better. Ms. Amna, you said about under the table strategic cooperation agreement pending the recognition. Well, I don't go along with that. Whatever we should have above the table and very open. It is all our policies have been under the table, have been cause of worry. Now, coming back to the topic, that is challenges and way forward. What is the biggest challenge for Afghanistan today? It is recognition. The Security Council Committee met in May, and they were not even willing to give approval to the word as de jure government. They did not agree with that. That whoever is dealing with the administration. and other things. So there is lots of things which have to be done. Now, if you want to join an international community for Taliban, you have to accept the rules and laws which have been agreed by the Afghan polity for the last 50 years. That is Charter of the Declaration of Human Rights. If you do not wish to commit to that and you want to be considered for the membership of the UN, that's why the thing has been postponed indefinitely. The voting has been stopped. So unless the world recognizes, even we go for the regional consensus, there would not be a regional consensus unless you say that you are ready to, why we comment on India, that India, by not agreeing to the charter, UN charter, is not legally bound to become the Security Council member. Same is the case for Afghanistan, unless the thing that you have agreed, human rights, women rights, then economy and everything, interaction would only, I'm cutting the story short. What I would like to say is that we should focus on the challenges and the way forward. Way forward is the clear message to Taliban. Please wake up, don't decimate your people, and don't let them die with hunger for your bad policies.
Thank you so much. Thank you. We can have the lady there.
Ambassador Sab, just to clarify,
No, just a moment. We'll take 3 questions and then we'll come to the answers.
Okay. Assalamu alaikum, it's Rabab Beg from Qaid-e-Azam University. My question is about the contemporary issue in Afghanistan, and it's about al-Zawahiri's assassination. So the presence of al-Zawahiri in Kabul marks the violation of Doha Accord, and then US using the Afghanistan airspace is breaching the sovereignty of Afghanistan. So my question is, how will assassination of al-Zawahiri impact the Taliban government? And it's directed.
Sorry?
How will the assassination of al-Zawahiri impact the Taliban government?
Thank you.
And my question is directed to all the
Thank you
panelists,
so
whoever
much.
want to answer.
We can have a question here. We'll come back to you. Ji. Thoda area and gender distribution. Ji.
I am Abdullah Zahid and I am a student at National Defense University. My question is, recently Taliban government blamed Pakistan of letting US use Pakistan's airspace for the drone attack. Can this mistrust lead to improvement of Indo-Taliban relationships? What's more beneficial for Pakistan, United States support or Afghanistan by its side?
Thank you. And who would you like to answer this question?
Anyone can answer.
Anyone, okay. So we begin with Bahir. You wanted to say something. Ji.
I just wanted to clarify that the scorpion and frog thing is how everyone views the other, especially with regards to Pakistan and India, despite whatever is presented at the back of their minds is always that this is the scorpion and it's in his nature to sting me. With regards to the Zawahiri thing, the Taliban don't think that it's a violation, because if you look at the second section of the Doha deal, which are the responsibilities of the Taliban, and the first part of clause of it actually states that they're not supposed to harbor groups that are a threat to the United States. So the Taliban break that down into 2 parts. One, they say that Zawahiri or people like him are not an active threat because it's not like they're plotting anything on the ground. And secondly, the Taliban have been playing the I didn't know he was here card. And that's tricky because Al-Qaeda is going to eventually announce their new leader. So if they do announce their new leader, then obviously Zawahiri has recently died, which will make it tough for them to get out of. With regards to aerial sovereignty, there are different opinions. I know Mullah Yaqub did say that the drones were coming from Pakistan. However, international politics dictates that unless you present evidence to show that, it really doesn't stand and no one's going to entertain it. So, but there is tension. Like that shows you that even within the Taliban, there is tension with regards to how to view Pakistan and how to approach it.
I didn't exactly get the recognition part, but the point is that, look, the international community, when the agreement was signed between the US and the Taliban, on what premise? Number one, on what premise? The fact that you sign an agreement with, say, an unstate actor. They weren't the legitimate government of Afghanistan. In that sense, I think the Americans themselves made them legitimate. And yes, there's a very thin line between de facto and de jure. But the fact is that, for example, now that the Indians have upgraded their embassy, yes, they haven't set their ambassador, but they have the deputy there. In what capacity are they engaging? In what capacity are they opening their missions? In what capacity is the EU there since January? In what capacity have regional countries had their missions in Afghanistan? I think there's a fine thin line that differentiates these two issues. But the fact is that there is engagement, and whether we like it or not, they are the dispensation in Afghanistan. Number one. Number two, coming to the strategic partnership agreement, I think the ambassador misunderstood. My point was that under the table, at least start exploring the opportunity of working towards some sort of a partnership. Because again, as I said, it bewilders me that these two countries that are so dependent on one another in so many aspects do not have anything in the form of a piece of paper. And that is why both countries have not been able to focus on other areas of the bilateral relationship. It has always been through the security lens. It has always been limited. And lastly, I'll just throw this in, that while they were talking the question on Zawahiri, how about putting the focus on this, that it puts into question, I think, more so on the American side, because the Americans left Afghanistan on this premise that Al-Qaeda was no longer a threat and that they had defeated Al-Qaeda. There's a statement from President Biden. So I think there's a question mark when it comes to that.
वो जो मुआहदे की बात हो रही है, the agreement is between United States of America and Islamic Emirates of Afghanistan, and in bracket written, not recognized by the United States. But this sentence and this word is repeated throughout the agreement, and it is the first time in the history of this word that a superpower, world hegemon as we say, has concluded an agreement with a non-state entity recognizing it as a state de facto, not de jure. That is why they both signed, and the agreement was signed in Doha, and from United States signed, their Secretary of the State signed it. So it does speak a lot about this. And secondly, about the missions, I think we heard Ambassador Abrar say 17 missions have opened in Afghanistan now. Ma'am, to you now.
Thank you, sir. I'll just borrow on to your conversation. And of those 17 missions, there are significant missions that are there. So we cannot ignore the fact that even if there is no official formal recognition happening, countries are more than willing, because of the economic investment that they have done in Afghanistan and because of the relevance of that state, that they want to work with the Taliban. One thing I would just share here is that even when the Ghani government was in power, and anyone would go to Afghanistan for resource development or of the various mines that they were there for the mining zones, even if they had taken the permits from the Afghan government, the real permit would come from the chit that was issued by the local Taliban leader. So if this is the type of control the Taliban even had while the Americans were there, so you can imagine how the things are working. So you know who are the actors who really mean business there. I'm not trying to act controversial. These are the realities. We can flower it, we can make it look much fancier and beautiful. But the fact was that for both the Afghan leaders of that time, prior to that, Karzai and then President Ghani, the legitimacy factor remained highly problematic. And there was no deep-rooted grassroots investment into the institutions that would sustain such fissures or shocks that would come. And of course, the Taliban's resurgence of the Taliban coming over was one of the biggest shocks that the Taliban, very small, nascent, weak, secular Taliban, Afghan society could cushion and take over. To the young scholar from NDU, to your question about US or Afghanistan, why do we need to make choices? US has its own relevance, Afghanistan has its own relevance. Afghanistan is our next door neighbor, shared borders, shared population, shared problems, and many of them that certainly we cannot afford a divorce. And so much going on. How can we overlook our next door neighbor, whether it's a happy, good next door neighbor, unhappy Afghanistan, or even if it is a very, very non-pleasant India at the moment, they are our next door neighbors. You cannot overlook them. And we cannot also overlook the US. It's a big power. And if you also bring into this question, should we go for the Asian powers? Yes, we should. But why should we bargain one against another? Why can't we have a diplomacy which is strong enough to work around all of these points and connect the dots? That's the beauty of diplomacy in general. Yes, rhetorics are different. One needs to be very careful as a leader as to what type of statements we are giving. But we can have a diplomacy that looks at different theaters in different motions, and it can all work very well for the country. Thank you.
Thank you so much. We go to the second round. Lady here, Ji, please.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamu alaikum. My name is Sadia, and your topic is broader than my question. My question is about that Afghan peoples who are living in Pakistan in the camps, and they left their country because of Taliban, and their demand is to send us another foreign country or kill us. What is your strategies? What is the strategy of government regarding them, and what is the what you are looking for them? Thank you.
My question will be from Mr. Obedullah. Here, I will highlight the almost neglected or the missing issue or challenge is the invisible battle. The invisible in the coming future is the children after war, because we have every issue has been highlighted in every seminars or events related to the Afghanistan after the Taliban takeover. That is the children after war and the long-lasting suffering, because this battle does not go so, and we have already seen the children physically as well as mentally has been affected from this war. And in the past, we have the children already has been used as a child soldier, human shield, as well as.
Can we request you to ask the question?
Okay.
What is the question, please?
How can prevent further children or what can be done? What can we do for these children to prevent conflict or war?
How can we prevent the children from being victims of the conflict, you mean? Ji.
Post-war.
Post-conflict rehabilitation of the children. Ji, please. Bahir, will you like to answer? Yes.
Answer. Look, there's a lot of really good literature on post-conflict states, and there's good literature on traumas, and especially generational trauma. And unfortunately, Afghanistan, we talked about the famine earlier, and this being one of the worst humanitarian crises in modern history. The problem is you think that you will walk into Afghanistan and you will see starving children on the side of the road, and you will feel that this is, do you know how like growing up you used to see pictures of Africa and the famine there? That's not what you see in Afghanistan. That just shows you the idiosyncrasies of the Afghan culture, because the people that are affected the most are the women and children that are inside their houses, right? So you don't see the suffering. And you're right, especially the children and the impact that all the suffering has on them. Something that I said that was very controversial when the Taliban were first taking over territory was a few videos that came out. In one, the Taliban were playing in a park. In another, they were jumping on top of a sofa. In the third, they were shocked at how big a TV could exist inside the house, right? And my comment on that was that this was a generation that was stripped of its childhood, right? And the reason we see so much violence is when you've never been allowed to be a child. So there is a lot of work if we start working on Afghans and especially on the children now, and that's what we're trying to fight. So we say we're not fighting just the violence that exists. Our non-violent movement in Afghanistan is against the structural violence that gives rise to these people to grow up in such an atmosphere. So it is an uphill battle, but we do recognize it. And I think it's an important part to be worked on, including everything else.
Thank you so much. About the lady's question.
Gee, thank you, Sadia. Number one, I don't represent the government. I teach at a university, and that's a public sector. So I can't have a governmental strategy here, but people coming from Afghanistan after the Taliban, that's not the first wave, as you very much are familiar with. The current wave, if you're talking about, just to qualify, the first wave of Afghan nationals who sought security in Pakistan was as early as 1978 and even prior to that. And then we have had different waves of Afghan nationals coming and seeking refuge. The current Taliban 2.0 people leaving Afghanistan, some of them are seeking refuge here. Some of them are just using Pakistan as a transitional ground. And there is an entire process through which the relevant departments and institutions are working. And they vet the cases. And depending on the strength of the case and what all is happening, then after a particular time period, those people are sent for further asylum. But also please do keep in mind that we are looking at a world which is filled with asylum seekers and refugees. So it becomes very problematic for them to cushion as many people. And that brings me back to the point that Abdullah has just mentioned here about the youth and all, that Afghanistan was the flavor of the day for few weeks or a couple of months. And that's as long as the global sympathy and attention was for them. Now it's Ukraine, tomorrow it's going to be something else. And of course, there is no match between a European refugee and a non-European refugee. So it's a very unequal world. But yes, there's a policy through which all this vetting process is happening. And they're trying to make it as best as possible.
Thank you so much. As a chair of the session, I have unpleasant work to do also. And that is to stick by the time given. Otherwise, she is going to haunt me. Ki aap kya kar rahe hain? Time khatam ho gaya. So thank you so much, everyone. And whatever questions are left, we will have the break now after this conclusion by the chief guest. Lunch break mein aap questions pooch sakte hain. But I will just say three, four points ke upar. I will give 1 to 2 liners. I think it is very important to understand the global competition which is going on. And I'm sure one of the speakers must have addressed it. The China-USA global competition, now Ukraine-Russia war. So presently that dominates the Washington, that dominates the word thought. Afghanistan, we like it or not like it, we call it fair, we call it unfair, has gone to the oblivion and is somewhere on the back burner, or rather back burner se bahut kahin piche chala gaya to the deep stores. So that is why the regional solution or regional thought becomes important. The countries of the region are most affected. It's not the United States of America which is most affected. Yes, it is important that what is their decision at the global level? Do they want to see a chaos-ridden Afghanistan or a peaceful Afghanistan? Perhaps the chaos-ridden Afghanistan may serve certain purposes here to scuttle the Belt and Road Initiative, CPAC, and keep a crisis of our life here in this region. But more importantly, it is a question for the countries like Russia, China, Pakistan, Turkey, Iran, Afghanistan itself, and even India. How do we want to see Afghanistan in the future? So this is very important. SCO or the OIC could be good forums where the India also joins you. But it's just food for thought. We have to take responsibility. Because Afghanistan should stand on its feet. Afghanistan has tremendous potential, a resilient nation, a brave nation. They have survived through so many ups and downs. Koi kehta hai Afghanistan has been graveyard of the empires. Koi kehta hai Afghanistan has never been free. It has been subjugated all around. But more importantly, it is a diverse society, ethnically diverse society, like Pakistan society. And unless you have strong political institution, that diversity cannot be turned into unity. And we are experiencing this problem as well. Afghanistan's integration into the regional processes, that is the trade, the connectivity, I think that is the best thing which can be done to Afghanistan so that they stand on their feet. They have been through 40 years of war economy. Lots of money came in. Someone said $70 billion came in. So those $70 billion have actually been kind of eaten up, evaporated, been sent to other countries and so on and so forth. Where are they? They're none there. So most important is that Afghanistan stands on its feet. It has minerals, jaise bhi humne baat ki, messianic is the second largest copper field in the world. Rare metals, iron, coal. India has also contracted certain mining contracts with them. China ne kaha, we'll make road, we'll make railways, we'll make a power plant there, messianic, and so many other things. Pakistan and China have agreed, and Afghanistan signed an agreement to build a motorway between Torkham and Peshawar. Afghanistan is already using the CPEC infrastructure, if you see it carefully. They use the Gwadar port for shifting of their or purchase and transportation of their fertilizers. They use the whole infrastructure of the CPEC ka hissa for trade with India, and you have opened their trade with India. It's a big concession. 16 crossing point hai, 12 aur khule 28 ho jayenge. So you are trying to do everything you can to integrate Afghanistan into the economy of the region, and it is important, but default ho bhi jayega because Iran, Chabahar, which was to go to India through a trilateral agreement, has been put on the back burner by India itself because of the American sanctions and all that. Now Afghanistan, China and Iran have contracted an agreement of 25 years, $400 billion. And it includes development of Chabahar to Haji Gak and Central Asia corridor, so many other oil industry and such things. CPEC is there. CPEC and this China-Iran agreement are going to make Chabahar and Gwadar complementary ports. These corridors are going to become complementary. It's just a question of time. When do the Afghans decide for themselves what is right and what is wrong? Last point about Pakistan and Afghanistan. We have very good memories from our childhood. There's no time to narrate those times. कि जब परमिट लेके जाते थे अफगानिस्तान में तोरखम में फिल्में देखने के लिए कि जी वहाँ पे मुगल आजम लगी है तो यहाँ से बस चलती थी and you just needed a permit to go. And people of Afghanistan and Pakistan have been connected for centuries. People to people contact का कोई मसला नहीं है, मसला सरकार to सरकार का है. And सरकार to सरकार can be solved if they agree to sit together, talk to each other heart to heart, soul to soul, mind to mind, and resolve each other's issues. तो उसके साथ सारे प्रॉब्लम्स रिजॉल्व हो जाएंगे. बीच में किसी को डालते रहेंगे, बात बनेगी नहीं. आपस में बात करें, मिलें, बैठे, एक दूसरे के गिले शिकवे दूर करें, जब यहाँ पाएं खाने खाएं और एक दूसरे को हेल्प करें. थैंक यू सो मच एवरीवन, एंड नाउ बैक टू यू. सॉरी आई टुक 5 minutes एक्स्ट्रा. 20 पे खत्म होना तब 25 पे, but I hope you don't find me for that.
Thank you so much, sir, for agreeing to be our chair, and thank you for hosting the session so smoothly. And thank you to all our panelists. Now I would like to move on to the concluding remarks, which will be given by our chief guest today, Ambassador Namul Haq, who is a Pakistani career diplomat who has served as Foreign Secretary. He has also served as the Foreign Minister of Pakistan in the caretaker government in the year 2007 to 2008. He has also remained Minister of State for Foreign Affairs from June 2002 to November 2002. Sir, I would like to request you to come on stage and give your concluding remarks.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. I would like to begin by offering 2 points of personal explanation. One is that I'm not an expert on Afghanistan, so I will be speaking as a layman and trying to give you an assessment, a realistic assessment of how I see the situation. And the second is that I'm not very fond of concluding sessions. People have been listening to speeches, they are tired, their patience is wearing thin, they want to get it over with and go to their lunch perhaps, and then relax a little. So perhaps we should, Riaz, Nadeem, do away with formal concluding sessions and calling guest speakers at concluding sessions. It would be better to present the report of the proceedings and get it over with. But as it is, since I have been practically coerced by Riaz Nadeem into offering these remarks, let me begin by saying that this conference is timely, in the sense that it's a few days more than 1 year now. It was on 30th of August last year that the last American soldier or coalition soldier left Afghan soil after a presence of 20 years in Afghanistan in the wake of 9/11. The irony is that after 2 decades of trying to teach democracy to the Afghan people through the barrels of the most sophisticated weapons in the world, killing countless Afghans, losing thousands of their own men, and spending close to $1 trillion, the United States and its partners handed back the reins of power to the same group of people whom they had ousted in 2001. During the earlier sessions of this conference, learned scholars and speakers have elaborated on different facets of the situation as it obtains in Afghanistan today, and have made a number of valuable suggestions, which in their view would enable the Afghan leadership to set its house in order and to secure its place in the Committee of Nations. It is not my intention to readdress the recommendations, which will be, I am sure, appropriately reflected in the report of the conference. Distinguished participants, we are all aware of the many problems facing Afghanistan and the Taliban government. To recap briefly, in the political field, they include non-recognition, an internal struggle between the moderate and the more conservative or hardline leaders, with the moderates being increasingly sidelined, presence in Afghanistan of militant or terrorist organizations like the Al-Qaeda, the IS, the TTP, the ETIM, and others, governance issues, UN and United States sanctions against many Taliban leaders,
and attacks, terrorist attacks on mosques, etc., which continue. In the economic field, Afghanistan has suffered greatly from the sudden cutoff of large doses of foreign assistance and budgetary support, and the freezing of its foreign assets amounting almost to $9.6 billion by the United States, food insecurity, extreme poverty, with almost 90% of the population said to be below the poverty line, and high levels of unemployment. There is then the issue of international demands for an inclusive government, the demands for providing education to the girl child, providing work to women, and the apprehension that terrorist organizations like Al-Qaeda, Daesh, and others are still operating in Afghanistan. Unfortunately, many educated Afghans and most of the rich Afghans have found refuge outside Afghanistan. Others are attempting to leave, creating further problems of governance in the country. Narcotics are one of the few profitable areas, with an estimated turnover of almost $4 billion a year, of which about 25% goes to the farmers and 3/4 goes to either the officialdom, the warlords, or drug smugglers. According to the UN Office on Drugs and Crime, Afghanistan accounts for 84% of the world heroin production, and the income from narcotics constitutes a major part of the GDP of Afghanistan. Thus, with a rising population of 40 million people, a GDP of about $20 billion, a per capita income of about $508 per year, an annual budget of $2.26 billion with a deficit of $500 million, and an external debt amounting to $1.4 billion, Afghanistan is one of the poorest countries in the world. Let me turn to bilateral Pakistan-Afghanistan relations briefly. Pakistani leadership appeared to be rather triumphant when the coalition forces and the Americans left Afghanistan. The then Prime Minister declared that the Afghans had broken the shackles of slavery. The then DGISI of Pakistan undertook a visit to Kabul and was seen on television in an expansive mood in a hotel lobby in Kabul, sipping tea and assuring journalists that everything was going to be fine. In doing so, perhaps Pakistan lost sight of the fact that apart from its own difficult economic situation, it would also inherit an additional responsibility of millions of people in dire economic trouble who had been financed by the United States and its coalition partners. There would thus be two insolvent economies right next to each other, and none of them would be able to help each other. And outside support would not be forthcoming. In fact, the population of Afghanistan is being punished by the West because of the alleged misdeeds of its rulers, that is the Taliban, by denying them the resources, the financial resources that belong to them. The result has been that both countries, both Pakistan and Afghanistan, have seen food shortages, have seen increased smuggling, because the prices of daily items in Pakistan are kept artificially low and far below world prices through subsidies. And it is a fertile ground for smugglers to make money by smuggling cheap items at more expensive rates to the Afghan people and to Afghanistan. Smuggling can be reduced and eliminated only if the prices of essential commodities in Pakistan and in Afghanistan rise to the level of world prices to ensure that it becomes unprofitable. But that would give rise probably to demonstrations and riots in both countries, because people would not be able to afford the food prices at those very high and inflated rates. Pakistan cannot feed 240 million of its own inhabitants. It has to import food from abroad, despite being called an agricultural country. And another 40 million Afghans have been added because Afghanistan is a landlocked country, and all access to food has to come through either Pakistan or Iran. Pakistan has also suffered deeply as a result of 4 decades of conflict in Afghanistan. There have been major economic losses. The government estimates them at $150 billion, but nobody can be certain what the losses were. Our children have become addicted to drugs. Gun culture has been produced. Drug money has been used to buy real estate in Pakistan. Terrorism has cost Pakistan more than 80,000 lives. And Al-Qaeda and IS have found space in Afghanistan and in parts of Pakistan to carry out their dastardly deeds. Both our countries are thus in a double bind. While we face multifarious problems because of unsettled conditions in Afghanistan, Pakistan particularly is also held responsible by the United States for the victory of Taliban and by the world of any excesses allegedly committed by them. The United States, in an official report, has stated that the Taliban succeeded because Pakistan provided the Taliban with sanctuaries and safe havens, financial support, intelligence support, logistics support, medical support, training, equipment, tactical, operational, and strategic direction and dimensions. That has meant that the United States and Pakistan relations have also suffered because of the situation in Afghanistan. And for many years now, the United States has denied bilateral assistance to Afghanistan. And in fact, a lot of money is owed to Pakistan by the United States, which the United States has never released, running into billions of dollars in the form of coalition support funds. Allow me to say a few words on recognition of the Taliban government. While our official stand remains that we do not recognize the Taliban government, the fact is that Pakistan has accorded de facto recognition to the Taliban. We have an embassy in Kabul, and a number of other countries do as well. And Afghanistan has an embassy in Islamabad. There are regular official contacts between the governments of the two countries. Historically, Pakistan has always recognized the rulers in Kabul as the legitimate government in Afghanistan. And furthermore, our policy of recognition is recognition of states, not governments. And we expect others also to follow the same policy. And I'll give you an example. There have been a number of military coups in Pakistan itself, but no country in the world has ever de-recognized Pakistan or the new government that has taken over as a result of a military coup. So therefore, Pakistan, in effect, fully recognizes the Taliban regime in Kabul. However, the formal recognition is being withheld under world pressure, and perhaps the policy should be formulated in consultation with neighboring states of Central Asia, with China, Russia, Iran, Turkey, etc. And a decision on recognition should be taken together. While our efforts should be aimed at helping the emergence of a peaceful, stable, and friendly Afghanistan, we should never lose sight of the fact that Afghanistan is an independent, sovereign state. Pakistan should never seek to speak on behalf of the Afghan people or their government. We should let them run the country the way they want to and insulate ourselves from policies which we may believe to be regressive. I would also like to talk briefly about Taliban's relationship with India. Many people in Pakistan, particularly during Ashraf Ghani's regime and Hamid Karzai's regime, felt that perhaps Afghanistan was becoming too close to India, that India was investing a lot of money in Afghanistan, and that it had established a number of intelligence outposts in Afghanistan to the detriment of Pakistan. Allow me to say that it is the right of the Afghan government to seek assistance from wherever they get it. And we should have no problem in Afghanistan having normal relations with India. The only caveat being that, and which the Afghans have assured us will never happen, is that the Afghan soil should not be used against Pakistan, and vice versa. That Pakistani soil should not be used against Afghanistan in any way. The recent killing of Ayman al-Zawahiri by the United States in a drone attack has angered the Taliban government, and their acting defense minister, Mullah Yaqub, has leveled the accusation that the drones were flying over Pakistan territory into Afghan airspace. Pakistan has officially denied this charge. However, such allegations made in public can have an adverse impact on the overall tenor of the relations between the two brotherly countries. Instead of leveling allegations in public, it would be better if the governments of the two countries discuss such issues in private with a view to resolve them. Distinguished participants, I will now give very brief one-liner responses to some of the questions about Afghanistan which have been raised and discussed during the conference. The answers are not based on fond hopes. They are based on the situation on the ground. And the first and the fundamental question is, what is the relevance of Pakistan and Afghanistan in the evolving world order? And my answer is very simple. Both Pakistan and Afghanistan are becoming increasingly irrelevant in the evolving world order. Let us be quite clear about it. Both of these states are insolvent. We are deeply indebted to the world. Our voice is not heard in the major decision-making centers of the world. Neither Pakistan nor Afghanistan is a member of any important organization like the G20 or any other major international financial forum. So let us not kid ourselves. The world is evolving away from us, not towards us, and we have no say in the way in which it is moving. Second issue, regional connectivity. People talk a lot about regional connectivity between India, Pakistan, Afghanistan, and Central Asia. But there are political problems among regional countries, and they are a major impediment. I will give you the example only of an energy corridor called TAPI, Turkmenistan, Afghanistan, Pakistan, and India gas pipeline. We have been hearing about it for the last quarter of a century, if not more. And there is nothing on the ground so far. But many of the speakers who talk on Afghanistan and Pakistan relationships speak glowingly when they talk about TAPI or the gas pipeline. It is not going to happen in the near future because the situation in Afghanistan is still unsettled. No country recognizes Afghanistan. India has its own conditions for receiving gas through TAPI, and that is why the matter keeps pending. Is there a possibility of a major civil conflict breaking out in Afghanistan? To my mind, the answer is no. There will be minor insurgencies. There will be terrorist attacks. But by all accounts, security in Afghanistan today is much better than it was when foreign forces were present in Afghanistan. The Taliban are in control and the security is improving. Bilateral trade between Pakistan and Afghanistan. I think Pakistan has about 22% share of bilateral trade with Afghanistan. 22% of the total Afghan trade flows through Pakistan. This can be increased and measures can be taken to ease the restrictions that exist on the transit of trade between Afghanistan and the rest of the world. with the sole exception perhaps of a demand that Afghanistan has and which Pakistan has not met so far, is direct trade between India and Afghanistan through Pakistani territory. Can drug trafficking be stopped? The answer clearly is no. Neither Afghanistan nor Pakistan have the means to stop the drug smugglers. Recently, you might have seen that a container containing 2.5 tons of heroin was apprehended in Mundra, a port in Gujarat, India. It's a private port owned by Advani, the richest man in India. And as a result of that seizure, no containers from either Pakistan, Afghanistan, or Iran can now be offloaded at that port. But the heroin trade continues apace. Can smuggling be reduced? To an extent. But officialdom on both sides is involved in facilitating smuggling. Therefore, my apprehension is that it will also not be reduced. Will the Afghan refugees go back? The answer is clear. No, they will not go back. They have been here for decades and they will stay on. Historically, people who have descended from the mountains into the plains have never gone back to the mountains. It is the responsibility of the world to help Afghanistan, but the world is shirking that responsibility. The West is burning billions of dollars worth of ammunition and weaponry in the war in Ukraine, but they cannot spend a few $billion to save the starving Afghan people. So we should be clear that no one is going to come to our help. We should stop looking to others to help us out. Unless we help ourselves, no help is forthcoming from anywhere else. I will conclude by noting that the future appears to be difficult, both for Pakistan and Afghanistan. Our populations are exploding. Our resources are shrinking. This is a clear mismatch which cannot continue. We have to control the explosion of populations both in Pakistan and Afghanistan. Resources of water are shrinking, resources of arable land are shrinking, resources of agricultural production are shrinking, and neither country has much energy. Energy is imported, and we don't have the money to import energy. Social services are not available and cannot cater for the increasing population. Youth bulge, which can be a positive thing, is negative both in Pakistan and in Afghanistan. Since it is neither educated, nor healthy, nor do the young people in either country have access to jobs. The job market is simply not available. Hence, law and order problems in both countries. Add to this the layer of climate change, greenhouse gases, rising temperatures, freak weather events like rains and floods, which is happening right now in Pakistan, air pollution, water pollution, for which we are doing absolutely nothing, toxic waste being dumped by other countries on our soil. They are destroying our environment, and there is nothing that we can do about it. They are blighting the hopes of our people for a bright future, and there is nothing that we are doing about it. God is not going to descend from the heaven to help us. We have to help ourselves. And if we don't, we have a very bleak future. I'm sorry for this very pessimistic assessment, but that is the realistic assessment. Thank you very much for listening so patiently.
Thank you so much, Ambassador Namal Haq. And on behalf of IRS, we're very grateful that you could join us and conclude the session with such pertinent and comprehensive remarks. I would like to thank all our panelists and all our chairs for such an interesting event today, and for our audience who very patiently sat through both the sessions. Lunch is being served outside in the hall, and we can convene there and continue the conversation if anyone has more questions for any of the panelists